The scientific revolution starts now.
This is the Science Podcast.
Let us see in the dark.
Yeah, sure. Well, so my formal day job is publishing this magazine, which is called Skeptic, the quarterly science magazine of the Skeptics Society, which is a 501c3 nonprofit that I direct. We have it sitting in my office here in Santa Barbara. And we started in 92. The magazine was founded by myself and Pat Lindsay there, and that cover there. She died 2 years ago, so we're kind of restructuring things here since her passing. But our main mission is really just to do what kind of cover topics that other scientific magazines don't cover but are related. So like pseudoscience. Most magazines don't deal with pseudoscience, just not in their wheelhouse, but we do. Or, how to deal with anti-vaxxers. If you're promoting vaccines, what are the arguments that the anti-vaxxers are making? How do you respond to those? Or the creationists, how would an evolutionary biologist deal with a creationist? And I noticed that even in the late 80s, when I was in graduate school, that I watched some debates between creationists like Duane Gish and evolutionary biologists. And they did not fare well in these debates because the debate wasn't really about evolution, the theory of evolution. They figured, well, if I know the theory, then I can just refute the arguments. But they're not arguing about evolution. They're doing something completely different, which has to do with promoting their own religious beliefs and just going anomaly hunting for anything that evolutionary biologists can't explain and so on. You have to kind of know what their arguments are. So that led to kind of a skeptical movement, which is a niche group of people that specialize in those kind of fringe claims, and Holocaust denial or climate denial, and conspiracy theories about vaccines and autism, or RFK Jr. has been on our radar for the last few months since he declared his candidacy for the presidency. He's been getting a lot of media attention. So we watched the whole 3 hours of RFK Jr. on Rogan and then deconstructed those arguments. And anyway, so that's the kind of thing we do. I have training as a experimental psychologist and as a historian of science. I have 2 graduate degrees, and that gives me enough breadth to cover a lot of different topics. Anything in the physical sciences, biological sciences, social sciences. I've read a lot and studied a lot of different subjects, so I can edit a magazine that focuses on any number of different things like that people care about. So our mission really is just to get out the truth. Do vaccines cause autism or don't they? Or do we not know? Well, okay, we can address that. That if it's a pure political issue, that science has nothing to say, like what's the correct percentage or number of people that we should allow across our borders every year? Well, that's not something we would tackle. That's a political question. But like on the abortion issue, well, science has something to say about the question when life begins. Even the question itself is problematic from a scientific perspective. So those are the kinds of things we could deal with. So our last several issues have dealt with more mainstream controversies. So we did one on trans, one on abortion, one on race, nationalism, economic issues, and then the latest issue that I just showed you, the kind of 1950s looking cover of energy, and how do we get sustainable energy, and what can science tell us about that? So that's kind of been what I've been doing for the last 3 decades, in addition to teaching like you guys as an adjunct, just because it's fun to be in the classroom, as you know, and writing my books and doing my podcast now. And so, and trying to keep up with the media landscape. It's as you also know, it's rapidly changing. What's the best way to communicate with people about science and the other things we deal with? And that's basically it.
Have you always been a skeptic? Is this something that was like bred into you? Have you?
Well, I guess the question. I guess what's that mean to be a skeptic? Really, I've just been interested in science since the day one of college, when I signed up for an astronomy class, only because I didn't know what to study in college. I was one of those just jocks in high school that basically majored in sports and girls, and I hadn't really given any thought to college, and I mean, this is how long ago this was. The SAT was not that prominent. People never talked about it. I remember my high school counselor saying, "Well, you should take the SATs." Like, what's that? And so I just showed up and did terrible and ended up at a community college and just signed up for this astronomy course because I love Star Trek and thought, well, this has something that has to do with space, so I guess I might like that. And that really introduced me to the world of science. And at the time, I was religious. I had become a born again evangelical Christian.
Hmm.
And from that community college, Glendale College, I went to Pepperdine University, which is a Church of Christ school. And I was a graduate of the first 4-year graduating class from the Malibu campus.
Beautiful location.
Yeah, I'm sure you guys have passed through there between Santa Barbara and San Diego.
Yeah, we just stayed down there. It's absolutely incredible. But
yeah, I loved it.
So they had astronomy at Pepperdine.
Now this was that I took.
Okay.
Oh, they did. Yeah. When I got to Pepperdine, I thought, boy, I wonder if I'm supposed to be a creationist. I didn't know much about any of this, and I thought maybe I was supposed to be a creationist, but they didn't buy any of that. They accept all science there, so that was an eye opener. And then, but from there, I went to graduate school and basically slowly gave up my religious beliefs. But for the whole time, I was always interested in the paranormal and the supernatural. If you're a Christian, you do believe in the supernatural. I mean, the idea that there's a deity, that Jesus died and was resurrected, and all that's grounded in the supernatural. But at the time, also there was popular New Age beliefs in the paranormal. Thelma Moss had a lab at UCLA where they studied Kirlian photography and hypnosis and altered states of consciousness. And Uri Geller was becoming famous, bending spoons, and all that astrology and all that stuff was huge. And I thought, well, I wonder, maybe there's something to it. What do I know? I'm just a kid. So I was interested in it. I embraced it. I thought this would be fun to study. And then when I got to graduate school, I brought this up with my professor, and he's like, "This is all bullshit." I'm like, what? So as I learned to think about claims from a scientific perspective, I just became skeptical because, in a way, scientists are just skeptics about everything until the evidence shows otherwise. So, the null hypothesis, that the claim your theory is not true, your hypothesis is not true, until you gather enough evidence to reject the null hypothesis and accept it. The results are not the result of chance, and something like that. So, and you can just apply that principle basically to anything. I think Bigfoot's real. Well, that's nice. I'm skeptical. Show me the body, and then I'll change my mind. I'll accept it. The whole UFO business of late. I've been doing a lot of media on that, and it's like, well, what would it take to change your mind, Shermer? Well, show me the spacecraft. Let's see this thing, like the Chinese spy balloon.
The Demystify Sci podcast is your source for an illuminated analysis of nature. But the fact of the matter is that we live in the real world where we have bills. And so if you want to help the podcast, you can come over to patreon.com/demystifysci and become a patron of the show. For just a couple of dollars a month, you're going to get access to a community of like-minded people who gather every week at our Sunday chats to dig deeper and deeper into the topics we cover on the podcast. But more than anything, you are going to give money to a project that matters. We're trying to make the world a better place, and we need your help for it. So consider coming over to patreon.com/demystifysci and giving us a couple dollars a month. If you can't do that, that's totally fine. We're organizing our first conference April 6th and 7th of next year in Austin, Texas. So consider blocking off that weekend on your calendar so that you have it available when tickets go on sale in the next couple of weeks. You can tell a friend about the podcast. You can come join our Facebook group. You can come join our Discord, or you can check out the list of affiliate links in the description and buy any of the books that are mentioned in this conversation as a way of getting learned and helping us make a little bread. I think that's it for now. Enjoy the rest of the conversation.
Right?
We were talking about that. I don't know if showing me the spaceship would even do it, though, is the funny thing. It's a really interesting thing because they've gotten so good with these deep fakes and video manipulation. And, somebody mentioned the other day, well, what if it landed on the White House and you saw a video of it? Would you believe it? Right. And I'm like, probably not, honestly. Yeah, that's a really tricky one.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I have not seen the Chinese spy balloon with my own eyes, but I accept it as real. Why? Well, we all saw the videos and photos. Okay, they might have been faked, but all the news media covered it. The president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Pentagon, Department of Defense, and so on. They all said it's real, and you could see the video footage of the ship scraping the debris off the ocean surface after they shot it down. It's like, okay, yeah, this thing's probably real. So to that extent, as I like to ask, does anybody care what the credentials were of the pilot that shot it down? No. Who cares what the credentials are? So the moment you hear people talking about the credentials of the pilots that saw the UAPs, you know they don't have any evidence because it doesn't matter what the credentials are if it's real. Yeah, right. So
it just seems like such a patently obvious place for there to be a strong disinformation campaign that's allowing something to happen in the background that I'm surprised by how few people have any serious skepticism over it. Where because on one hand, it feels...
How about the Guatemala incident, the UFO and Guatemala invasion and all of that?
I don't know.
Oh, somebody just showed me this Twitter post the other day that had a couple of links to these recently declassified CIA documents where they were planning a fake UFO event to cover up for their invasion of Guatemala. I was like, yeah, of course. Like that's definitely what's happening here. I just wonder who's getting invaded.
It just seems like when you're watching this stuff happen from a distance, there's so many different actors that are all part of it, that all have some vested interest in participating. Like you have the whistleblowers, and the whistleblowers are getting press, they're getting attention, they're getting pulled in front of Congress, they're getting book deals, they're on podcasts, they're able to make money off of it. And so they are all incentivized to produce a cohesive narrative that pushes everyone into the direction of believing that something is there. The congressional hearings are important for, I think, Congress people to make it look like they're doing something. Because if there's UAPs and they're not doing something, then they look bad. And if there aren't UAPs and they're not getting to the bottom of why everyone's saying that they're UAPs, they're also not doing something. And so there's just every single person who's involved in disclosure, to me, seems like they have an ulterior motive. And there's not really any new evidence that's being laid out. And yet the fervor continues constantly, everywhere. People are like, how can you not believe it at this point? Like, we have a friend who's just constantly telling us.
It's kind of a bummer to be a skeptic, right?
Yeah.
I feel like you're always that guy in the room who's just kind of deflating the happy balloon.
It is. I am that guy. And I just got off the Galileo Project Zoom meeting a couple hours ago with Avi Loeb and Chris Mellon and Nick Pope and the others who, lean heavily toward thinking that UAPs are extraterrestrials. And those guys spend every day, all day on TV, just doing interviews. And I've gotten not one call from any of these TV shows that interview them. They don't want to talk to somebody that says, it's probably not true. It's not impossible, could be, but probably not. But that's the problem. The media doesn't cover this objectively. And also, Anastasia, you mentioned, this kind of drive toward a certain conclusion by a handful of people. That's exactly what's going on here. The people that were behind that congressional hearing were Leslie Kean and these other people, Ralph Blumenthal and a few others that wrote that original New York Times article in 2017 about the Pentagon's UAP program. Okay, and so people said, look, the New York Times said it's real. No. Leslie Kean is not a New York Times employee. She is a UFO promoter and author of books and articles about UFOs and other New Age stuff, near-death experiences and the afterlife, and she's into all that stuff. And she managed to, in cahoots with, or in collaboration with Ralph Blumenthal, who is a journalist, but he wrote a biography of John Mack, who was the Harvard psychiatrist who believes the stories that his patients were telling him about being abducted by aliens. This is just sleep paralysis that these people are experiencing. But he believed that it was real, right? So, and when people say, well, the New York Times said, aliens are real. No, they didn't even say that. They just said the Pentagon has this program to look into UAPs. That's it. And then a follow-up article said, well, we checked with the Pentagon and about these videos, could they be faked? Shilo, you mentioned, could be a CGI video. Well, the Pentagon came out and said, no, the videos are real. They're not CGI fake videos. Those are real videos that these Navy pilots shot. So immediately this gets transmogrified into the Pentagon says the aliens are real. No, they didn't. They said the videos are real. So you see what happens.
Right after that came out, I there was a very unseen Forbes article where there was a defense contractor that had recently debuted this incredible holographic technology that they were projecting from satellites that would have heat signatures and look like an airplane and would be traced on FLIR radar. And I was like, is anybody seeing this? Like, hey, I mean, it sounds almost identical to these sightings, but yeah, you're absolutely right. They reported that they had this footage. They didn't report that they had, aliens on this footage.
Yeah. So the way they've gotten Congress's attention is not by promoting the alien part, but that it could be foreign assets, Russian or Chinese drones or spy planes or something like that. And you better get in there and look into this because American airspace is being, buzzed by these possibly foreign assets. Well, if you're a politician and, your job is to protect the country and the Constitution, so, well, it's hard to just ignore it just in case. And that is a possibility. It's again very unlikely that that's what these things are. But for one, if Russia had some kind of super advanced technology like that, wouldn't we see it in Ukraine, right? Or the Chinese, buzzing, say Taiwan with their super advanced drones. And in any case, we know a lot about the history of science and technology, and no invention in technology or idea in science comes out of nowhere. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing and researching. It's all stepwise, incremental, and no one gets very far ahead of anybody else, either corporations or governments. So even the Manhattan Project, the most secret scientific project ever, the Russians had a spy in there, Klaus Fuchs, who stole the plans and
the
passed
British
them on.
guy.
Yeah, right. From the movie. That's a great movie. But that happens a lot. We rip off other people. They rip us off. Even private corporations with their teams of lawyers and patent laws protecting their property rights and so on. All cell phones, smartphones, all computers like this, and all technology is pretty much the same. They're all at the same level. It would be like if we were still flying biplanes and the Russians had the equivalent of the stealth bomber. That's what we're talking about with these UAPs. Oh, they're able to pull these incredible high Gs without killing the pilot, so they must have some anti-gravitational technology. No, we would know about this. We have DARPA and the CIA, and we have spies. We have people that specialize in that that kind of research, and there's no such thing. We would know about it if they did.
And if you're in DARPA, right, and you have a holographic projection that's entire goal is to distract enemy radar or enemy pilots, and you're testing that out on your own pilots, the best case scenario is that the public thinks it's aliens. Like, that's a wonderful situation for you testing secret military technology, right?
Sometimes I do wonder if there's somebody in the back room having a big chuckle about all the UAP UFO stuff. Let's let them run with this for the next 10 years, and that'll be a distraction from what we're really doing. Yeah. Right. So I can imagine someone like Marco Rubio, with his power and influence, he gets in to see the spaceships in the warehouse, wherever this is. And it's just some like DARPA project. He's like, oh, it's a DARPA project. Yeah, we've been working on this thing for years and nobody knows about it. And of course, you can't go out there and tell everybody what we just showed you. Yeah, of course I can't. No, we don't want the Russians, Chinese to know what we have. All right, so go out there and tell them you didn't see anything. Okay. And then so we get no further. If it's anything, it's something like that.
Go out and tell them it's aliens. It's even better.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It is interesting, though, like your own path to skepticism seems to have been started off because you wanted to believe in these things. You wanted to believe in the supernatural, and you just weren't able to convince yourself that it was true. And I think
mostly, for the most part, wanting to believe. I just didn't know anything. And, when experts, so-called experts, tell you something is true or probably true, it's like, well, okay, what do I know? But then when you know more and you read up on it, it's like, well, I don't know. That doesn't sound so plausible after all. So my skepticism came largely through just experience of checking things out. I'm probably a little more open-minded than most other hardcore skeptics in thinking, this might be possible just in case. I don't want to be that guy, a century from now who said, this can never happen. And then it turns out, like Lord Kelvin saying, we can never achieve, human powered flight or whatever it exactly was he said. And then, 5 years later, the Wright brothers, like, oh, you don't want to be that guy.
Do you think that there's a limit to the kind of details that we can figure out using science? Because I come across that sometimes where...
Like what?
Okay, well, let's say that something like telekinesis or some kind of near-death experience or being able to read auras or whatever is something that is highly dependent upon setting, and varies immensely from person to person. Is it possible that the tools of science are such that they functionally prevent you from being able to detect if it's real or not?
That is one of the arguments made by paranormalists, that the tighter you make the controls, the weaker the effects get, not because it's just chance and randomness and the tighter controls eliminate those and you end up with nothing. It's that those weaken the effects, even to the point of the presence of a skeptic in the room with the test subjects weakens their ability to detect the signal, that whatever it is, remote viewing or the Zener cards or whatever. But the problem with that argument is that then how would you ever know if it's true or not? If there's no way to test it, even in principle, then it just becomes a hand-waving argument to say, we don't have any evidence and this is why.
And so is the reason that it matters whether or not it's true is because people are going to use it to exploit others?
Well, that would be a practical argument for it. But I think even deeper than that, we want to know what's actually true. I mean, I don't understand quantum physics, but I'm told by my physicist friends that it's like the best theory ever. And there's just, massive amounts of evidence for it. It's like, okay, I accept it. I don't understand it. But, it's this spooky, weird action at a distance stuff. Okay, even Einstein said he just really had a hard time buying it. Feynman said anyone who says they understand quantum physics doesn't understand quantum physics. Okay, then what are we talking about here? Apparently it's really true, even though it's pretty spooky and weird. But that doesn't mean everything that's spooky and weird is true. There has to be some way to get at it. And the quantum physicists have these experiments that they run. They go, look, there it is, the X places after the decimal point accuracy every time you run this experiment. It's really true. Okay. But the paranormalists don't have anything like that. What they have is that the tighter you make the controls, the weaker the effects get. If that happened in quantum physics, they would say, well, there's something wrong with this idea. It's just not holding up.
Yeah, and so I guess numerical accuracy is a viable control, but I think about it in context of religion a lot, where I think that it's valuable for people to believe in something that is larger than themselves and more mysterious than just sacks of meat going about their lives. Because that's a very...
Yeah, I think that it might be a mistake to throw religion into the same bag as supernaturalism, even though they overlap significantly often. It seems like historically, it's like we've been studying a lot of ancient mythology on the show lately, and it seems like the goal of a lot of the precursors to religion was really to formalize how people should behave on Earth and how they how they integrated themselves into the cosmos and the landscape and into their own communities and so forth. And it seems like religion still has the ability to do that for certain people, but oftentimes they get obsessed with the superstition of it all, and that kind of, it sort of casts a cloud over the entire operation.
Well, there's like a fracture that's happened here, right? So you had conventional religion that was within the church or organizational confines. Then that starts to decline and you see the rise of the New Age. And the New Age is basically taking the ideas of spirituality that were present in some rudimentary form in the church and applying them to new paradigms that are no longer bound by the strictures of, a 5,000-year-old book. And it's inside of that New Age paradigm where I feel like a lot of the weirder stuff comes out, where it's seances and near-death experiences and mind reading and all of these other things that are now put into place. And I think that I'm just trying to get at the question of, okay, so we have science, which is all about numbers. It is all about certainty. It is all about saying what is versus what isn't. And what science has done is it has turned attention to the New Age to say, hey, this isn't true, this isn't accurate. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, I think that there's something ineffable about the New Age that might be good for people. And that when we are too skeptical and we're too careful to gloss it over as being unimportant, we might be causing some psychic damage to people.
Depends what you mean by good for people.
Okay.
So religion, we know as a very broad concept, does have benefits for society, for people's lives. We know from lots of studies, religious people donate more money, they give more blood. They man the soup kitchens more than secularists. They're happier. They live a couple of years longer on average. On most measures of subjective well-being, they score higher than non-religious people do, and so forth. Okay, but religion is such a broad word; it stands in for so many different things, and so social scientists have dug into this. What exactly is the mechanism here? It's not like God is reaching into the world to stir the particles and make good things happen for religious people as reward for their faith. It's that it's a social structure, and having community, having friends, having somebody you love and that loves you, and having community and having a purpose in life that takes you out of yourself, that's bigger than you, having awe and wonder at the universe and beyond your tiny little life, does have salubrious effects on people's health, their longevity, their happiness, and so forth in very measurable ways. That doesn't require any of the boogaboo, woo-woo, supernatural stuff. It's just, so I was just reading an article published last week on happiness. And the number one predictor of happiness is being married. That is, having somebody that loves you and that you love. That's by far the best predictor. And then there's a few other things like having meaningful work and a purpose in life and a community and friends, things like that. And so religion does that, but not because of some supernatural reward by the deity. It's just that's what it does, and it serves a useful purpose. It may have evolved for something like that. As a kind of a group living, as a social primate species, we need to get along. We need to be able to resolve conflict, and reward pro-sociality and reciprocal altruism and all these things that are good for groups. And religion, to a certain extent, encourages that. Accentuates that, and that's good. So you can call it whatever you want, whatever the right word is, but anybody can get it.
Anastasia is trying to say is like science does a great job of leading us towards a better technological future, but it doesn't seem to be able to address that spiritual side of existence, which seems to be a place where the Western civilization is hurting the most right now. And is there any danger in being overly skeptical of non-scientific experiences? That,
I guess it depends what you mean by science. Again, that's a bit of a loaded word. Here we might turn to, you're not going to turn to the paleontologist to find out about what's right and wrong in moral debates, but you might turn to the philosopher, or secular humanism or Enlightenment reason, rationality, the whole body of knowledge developed by scientists and philosophers over the last 2,500 years, let's say, since the ancient Greeks, and say, just look at the whole body of knowledge and wisdom that we've gathered as a species and go, okay, what works in terms of making people's lives better? And the narrow word scientist, that wasn't even developed until the mid-19th century. William Ewell coined this word scientist. Before that, it was just, well, these are just philosophers. They're just natural philosophers. Newton was not a scientist. He was a natural philosopher. And, so the idea that, we can take the whole corpus of knowledge and apply it to the human condition in any area, that's what I think we should be doing. That's my mission. Now, a lot of scientists don't see that. They think, well, there's some is-ought wall there, Hume's naturalistic fallacy. You can't derive an ought from an is. I think that's a pretty thin argument. He himself didn't make the argument too strongly. And, we do this all the time. In any case, the way the world is, it helps us understand what we ought to do. And so I just kind of look at that whole thing and go, okay, can we it's not replace religion so much as take what's good out of religion and then add what we know from philosophy and science and everything, the whole corpus, I think. And we have been doing that, since the Enlightenment. That's the scientific revolution, the age of reason, the Enlightenment. We've been doing that to solve problems like slavery, torture, murder, homicide, war, genocide, and so on. Civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, and so on, animal rights. I mean, these all derive from rationality, reason-based arguments. Ultimately, yes, you need laws and governments to prohibit things and so on, but ultimately you have to change people's hearts and minds, and you do that through better arguments. And those arguments have to be based in reason at some level. And invoking a deity doesn't really help because everybody has a belief in a deity and they are often in conflict. And that itself is not a good solution because the conflicts often erupt into, religious wars in the past. So I think we're on the right track.
I mean, I definitely agree with the idea of a deity that sits somewhere and is the arbiter of what is right and what is wrong and is omnipotently observing things doesn't really make sense to me. And I think that it's probably better to move away from that because, like you said, religious wars, the conflict that's integrated in it. But I just worry about science having shifted away from natural philosophy and become something that is kind of a cudgel in and of its own right. The same way that religion is a cudgel, where there is, I think, a fair criticism to be made of peer review and consensus science, that it is a mechanism of stifling the proliferation of multiple viewpoints within a field. And because we give it so much credit and we give it so much weight and we value consensus so much, I worry that it's not the right organizing principle for a society because of the way that it can be molded into these directions where you see people come up with conclusions because they can tweak the data that they want to tweak in such a way that it gives them the right p-value.
Or literally just ask the questions they want to ask, right?
Or just ask, let's be less conspiratorial about that. You ask a question in the right way and you get the answer that you want. And so we have this image of it as being the paragon of truth and the only way that we have to search for it. And yet, as having come through the academy, I know that that's not accurate. And so it concerns me. It concerns me because it's better than what we used to have, but I still think it's a long way away from perfect.
Yeah, well, I agree. And since the replication crisis erupted around 2010 or so, we know that half the papers published and probably never been published, the social sciences and medical sciences, they're either so complex, like in the medical research, that they can't be replicated just because it's hard to control for everything. Or in the case of social sciences, they're just too simplistic. No human behavior has a super simple cause. Things like holding a cup of something that's warm, and then I meet you and I assess you as being a warm personality or something like that. Well, these are just so lame. And there's dozens like that never replicated. They should have never been published. Standing at the top of an escalator versus the bottom of the escalator, you give more money to charity or something like that. And these again failed to replicate. So how did they get published in the first place? Well, you hinted at it with hacking the p hacking the p values, throwing out certain data points that that pull the values away from the p you want to get, and so on. But in response to that, scientists have developed tools to get around that, like posting ahead of time the experiments you're going to run, all of them, and then report all of the results so that we don't just read about the 1 out of the 10 experiments you ran that was significant. What about the other 9, the file drawer problem, that kind of thing. And so, yes, you're right. It's not perfect. And, on a lot of issues, there may never be consensus. I mean, or at least it may be difficult to get consensus. And so we just have to live with uncertainty.
Especially the more technical that they get. And that's what worries me, because you said something earlier about quantum physics, where you're like, well, they get the same values from experiment to experiment, and they say that it's complicated and nobody really understands, and I trust them. And I think that generalizes outwards to other fields as well, because you get to a point with the statistical approaches that people take to their data where it's not like you can go into any paper once you're sufficiently trained and be able to tell exactly what they did to their data to get to the conclusions that they want. It's they can pre-register it and still do something crazy with it because the statistical approaches are so complex and there's so much data. And
well, there's also just, I think we're glossing over this entire aspect of interpretation, and a lot of times that's missed because the standard scientific method is really an engineering method where you test and iterate and try to come up with some model that's reliable. But ultimately, the scientists take the step of interpreting what the data means. And in the case of quantum physics, it is kind of a disaster because the interpretations they've made of those experiments are loony and they don't actually make sense. And that doesn't mean that the data is problematic or that even the mathematical models are problematic. It just means that nobody's come up with a proper interpretation for what's actually happening. And so it seems to me that comes with its own host of dangers. But I think people often overlook that interpretive level of science because they're so fixated. You don't need that interpretive level to build an airplane. You just need to know, like, the flight equations are like this. If I modify the wing, it does this. Like, you don't need to know, like, how the molecules are interacting and what's actually happening at the quantum level for an airplane. There's so little interpretation necessary for technology. So, yeah, I don't know. That's a bit of a rant, but
I think that to wrap it up, it's like, okay, so let's say that you have pre-registration and you have scientific findings that are solidified ahead of time in terms of at least how you're going to approach them. Your narrative that you construct, because we all construct narratives when we tell stories about data, because data is just numbers. And what you do at the end of the day is you have to take all of those numbers and you have to assign them to actors that are doing something and you have to tell a story. And it's possible for that to go astray because the story that we want to tell is parallel to the story that actually is, and we either can't see it or we don't want to see it. And I wonder if you've come across that as a skeptic, if you've ever wandered into a place where you're like, oh, that's really interesting, because by turning this a little bit, you can see it from a different perspective. And both of these things run parallel, and yet there's only one version of events.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, there's a couple things there. The different levels of analysis, Shilo, you mentioned, these quantum effects. So it's like people like my friend Deepak Chopra talk about, how matter, is mostly empty space, right? The space between the nucleus of the atom and the electrons is vast, and so it's mostly empty space. Yeah, but that's not the world we live in. We live in the macro world where it really is a hard, surface. I can't push my hand through it.
I just like whenever people say that, I've recently had to I've had a breakthrough in how I think about this. I'm like, a propeller is also mostly empty space.
Yes.
But when the propeller is moving, it is very much a solid surface. And I think that atoms are the same way.
Yes.
And I think that all of that quantum nonsense of like, if you bounce a ball against a wall enough times, it might go through because that's like what quantum tunneling is or whatever. I think it's a deep misunderstanding of what the atoms are actually doing to create the surface. That's an aside. I'm sorry, continue.
Remember that movie, The Men Who Stare at Goats, based on John Ronson's book of that same title about the General Stubblebine, who believed all this quantum woo-woo stuff, that it's mostly empty matter, and so you could just run straight through a wall if you think hard enough. So in the movie, they show him just, bam, just a face plant right into the wall. It's hilarious.
Right? Like, but we hear these things that people say with certainty, and everyone just kind of nods along, like, sagely. It's like, yeah, that's just a weird thing about quantum physics. And nobody's like, well, actually, I think that's probably a lack of full interpretation of what's happening that we should debate a little bit before accepting blindly.
Yeah, maybe at some point we're sliding into metaphysics and philosophy or something like that, and we're off the page of science. We talk about those things. At some point, maybe we hit an epistemological wall where we just can't know. We just don't know anymore at this point. And maybe a century or two from now, if we had this conversation, we would know much more, and so we'd understand these things. So we're all stuck in our culture and our time, and that's just the way it goes. If I knew what I shouldn't believe, I wouldn't believe it, but I don't. So the narrative stories we tell ourselves, that's all we have, based on data or not. And and one final point on that, from what you said earlier, Anastasia, about kind of what religion does, and again, this idea of awe and wonder. Well, believe it or not, there are social scientists who study awe. There's a book called Awe, by Dagner Keltner at UC Berkeley, and he just collects data on what makes people feel like they're in awe. And it's just obvious stuff, like, just go walk barefoot on a beach, go for a hike in the mountains on a little single track trail with huge trees and, vistas of far off mountains, this kind of stuff. Or you can even get it from just everyday stuff. Just go outdoors and get some sunshine and some air in your face and things like that, it's like, why? Okay. So religion does some of this for us. If you go into a cathedral, I mentioned my wife's from Cologne, Germany. So whenever we go there, we go to the dome, the Cologne Cathedral there. It's magnificent. It is unbelievable. I'm an atheist, and I feel like totally spiritual awe struck in wonder when I go in there. And we light a little candle, and it's romantic, and it's stained glass windows with the sun coming through. It's like, wow, this is really amazing. I really get it. If it was 500 years ago and I lived in a mud hut somewhere, I made the trek to the dome, the Cologne Dome, and be like, wow, that feels awe and wonder. But I feel the same way when I go in a astronomical observatory, like the Lick Observatory or the Mount Wilson Observatory, the one down in San Diego, Palomar, the ones in Hawaii. I mean, they're just incredible. They're just these kind of vistas of the universe. And you stand in there and look up, and I feel the same way as being in a cathedral. So I think that's not really science. I don't know what that is. It's, it's kind of spirituality, or it's awe and wonder from the findings of science or the instruments of science. So, let's not give religion too much credit while we're giving them some credit, because you can get it from many different ways.
Well, there's something about the way that those cathedrals in old Europe are distributed, where every town of 10 huts has a world-class cathedral. And you walk around in America and you go to a podunk town of 100 people, and there is not a Lick-level planetarium that you can walk into and experience. And that's, I think, the thing that's missing, is that science, by its very nature, seems to be an elite pursuit. And I say that as somebody that has a PhD from an Ivy League university, that has spent the last 20 years of my life as a scientist. I recognize that there's something about it that is not go ahead.
I was going to say accessible.
Yeah, it's not accessible to the common person in the same way that the awe and majesty of a cathedral in every little town is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you were talking about RFK earlier, and the act of having to deal with the way that people represent scientific conclusions in ways that aren't totally in alignment with consensus, and how you can deconstruct their claims. And there's something, I think, that's really interesting there about the way that the vast majority of people interact with science versus the people who are highly trained in the techniques of science interact with it.
Yeah, okay, let's think about this. Certainly the pursuit of science is kind of elitist, but so is any profession. I grew up, would have loved to be a Major League Baseball player. Many are called, few are chosen, right? I'm a bike racer, and I would have loved to have done the Tour de France, but I just wasn't that fast, so I did my own thing, long distance cycling. It's just most people can't do most things. Why aren't there more people as CEOs, more women as CEOs? Well, most people can't be CEOs of Fortune 500 companies. You're already at the point, you're 6 sigma out from the mean for any of these elite positions, even, medical school or law school. Just take medical school. I saw a study, something like the average IQ of medical doctors is like 130. But once you're in there, everybody's a 130 on average, some below, some above. So your super intelligence doesn't really matter at that point. There's something else that makes people more successful or love the job more or whatever. So I think while that's true of science, it's true of anything. It's like watching these like American Idol, these TV contest shows. You have this line of people out 6 blocks down the street that want to try out. They all think they have great voices and so on. That they don't. They sound like me in the shower. Right? They stink. Most people can't be rock stars and great singers and performers, and power laws really do apply. Where 1% of the athletes make 99% of the money. 1% of authors, have 99% of the book sales. And so on. It's just across the board. 1% of podcasters, since we're on a podcast, have 99% of the audience. Joe Rogan sucks up, 99% of the audience or whatever. I'm exaggerating a bit, but I think that's just
Only a bit.
No, not that much. I think that's just a fact of life. But the thing about science is it's not like a guild that you are excluded from if you jump through the hoops. You went to an Ivy League college. Well, you don't have to go to an Ivy League college. You can go get a PhD in any number. There's thousands of state universities that give PhDs. You can do it. Anybody can do it, especially now. Pretty much all barriers, particularly with the latest Supreme Court decision, that these universities are not going to discriminate on anything. Anybody can come in. And okay, all right, remove the barriers and let people do whatever they want. Okay, that's good. And I think that's true for science as well. I mean, I can't. I can go into quantum physics if I want, but I can't because I just don't do that kind of math. I'm not that smart in that area. I can't do it. Too bad. So I don't think that's the limiting factor so much as just human abilities have limitations.
But at the same time, you must be aware of an anti-scientific sentiment that is pervasive in some communities.
That's not like there's not an anti-baseball sentiment or an anti-rock star sentiment that carries the same.
Like we live in way out in the country, and honestly, the people out here, by and large, are not big fans of science. Like
our mechanic is.
I guess it happens. It happens. But like I was playing in this band, and I went, and somebody I just gotten hired to teach astrophysics, and somebody brought that up as a dig, oh yeah, Shiloh's a professor, and everybody's like, oh,
that guy, he's one of those. Oh no!
I was like, what? I thought they'd be happy for me.
Okay, but what is that really tapping into? I don't think it has much to do with science. I think it has to do with elitism, a distrust of authorities, which has been on the rise over the last decade or two. If the science challenges one of your core beliefs, so climate science didn't used to be politicized, but by the time Al Gore's film An Inconvenient Truth came out in the late 90s, then global warming got bundled with the Democratic Party, with liberals, and then it became politicized. So, in the brain of a conservative, if they hear global warming, their brain autocorrects to, anti-capitalism, anti-American business, and so on. And vaccines the same way. It's become politicized since COVID-19, especially. And conservative Christians accept most science, but they don't like evolutionary biology. What is it about evolutionary biology? Because I think in their mind they think, and maybe this is due to some cudgels wielded by some scientists, that you have to be an atheist if you accept evolution. So if you tell a conservative Christian, I want you to understand Darwin's theory of evolution, and by the way, you're going to be an atheist when I get done, they're not even going to listen. I have to give up Jesus to accept Darwin? Forget it. Not going to happen. Right? So you have to take that off the table. And I think most people in most areas accept most science. They don't really know much about it. Even people who say this is a study by Andrew Stuhlman at Occidental College, that people who say that they accept the theory of evolution, and you ask them, what is it? They'll give you some explanation that's Lamarckian. Oh, the giraffe stretches its neck and then the babies have longer neck. No, that isn't what it is at all. So when they say I believe it, what they're saying is I trust science. Those guys usually get it right most of the time. And, what do I know? So I'll just say I believe it. In the same way, another study by another psychologist on NAFTA. Do you accept NAFTA or do you reject NAFTA? But whatever the answer is, if you ask people, well, what is NAFTA? They have a hard time articulating it. They barely know what it means. The North American Free Trade something or other, and I'm not sure what countries are in it, but I'm against it, or I'm for it because my party is. So these are proxy beliefs. They stand for something else. And I think most of us do that. Again, what do I know about quantum physics or even climate science? People send me these papers. They're very technical. Here's why you should be skeptical, Shermer. I read it. I really don't understand these computer models. And so we rely on the consensus, and it's not perfect, but that those scientists have gone through the mill already of testing each other, challenging each other, such that by the time you and I read about it in the newspaper or whatever, in a popular magazine, then it's like, yeah, okay, they probably got it right. They may all be wrong. The 97% of scientists who say they think global warming is real and human caused, they may all be wrong, but probably not. So I think that's what's going on.
I think it just
there.
needs tempered with the realization that all science is progressive. We're always updating the way we understand the world. The way that we understood biology 200 years ago is very different than the way that we understand it now. And science has to march forward like that. We're always going to need to keep our minds open to the fact that our understanding was incomplete. And so when I think of why do I trust the science? And it's like, what I mean by that is that I trust that there is a rational explanation for this phenomenon. I don't know what it is, and I don't know if anybody knows it perfectly, but I do believe that there is an accessible mechanism, and we can figure it out. And we're probably well on our way to doing so with most of these things that are being studied and published. But at the same time, we probably don't know everything. We got to keep that humility.
Yeah. But not only that, but I think that science has a unique relationship to the state that really directly affects the way that people live. Like you mentioned vaccine skepticism in the aftermath of COVID. And it's like, well, it's not particularly surprising to me that there was a lot of skepticism for a vaccine of varying degrees of efficacy that resolved to not fantastic, that was mandated for people to take, which they lost jobs over. Their restaurants closed. There was just so many direct effects on people's lives that were overwhelmingly negative that you can make a quantitative point about, okay, well, this is the number of lives that we saved because of these interventions. This is the number of lives that were ruined because of these interventions. And so we have a scale and we place these things on the scale. And in terms of the public interest, the number of lives that we have saved definitely outweighs it. But then in the back of your mind, you're like, okay, well, the pharmaceutical companies are not objective arbiters of the efficacy of their products. We know that they lie about things. We know that they don't release the data the way that they should release the data, like the Vioxx scandal. There's all this crazy stuff about women's health with various hormonal implants that cause terrible complications that no one can seem to be brought to bear to actually be responsible for the things that are happening to these women. Weird things that happen in the background that the people who are not inside of the consensus are pointing to and are frustrated by and seem justifiably skeptical of. And sometimes I'm concerned that some of the climate change, decarbonization stuff also has a reliable criticism of it. Which comes from that camp. And I don't think that it can be dismissed outright without really, really losing something valuable.
Here's the problem. Okay, Anastasia, I love everything you just said. Let's say you're the governor of your state of Oregon, and it's, I don't know, February, March of 2020, and you hold a press conference, and everybody wants to know, do we close the schools tomorrow or not? Do we close restaurants tomorrow or not? Tell us what to do. And you give some Bayesian argument. Well, you see, it could be this, but the probability of that, we just don't know. We have to weigh this. We have to weigh that. Stop. What do we do tomorrow?
What we do tomorrow is for a brief period of time until we can get people out exercising, we can get people taking care of their bodies, until we can put a tremendous amount of effort into getting every single person a gym membership and increasing ventilation in all of these fitness spaces. We will have to momentarily take a break and close things down. But our goal is to make sure that people's bodies are as healthy as humanly possible so that we can focus the resources that are necessary on the people who need the resources. Michael, they closed the woods. It was illegal to go into the woods.
That's astonishing.
I was going to say a couple of weeks of making a bad decision is one thing, but like perpetuate. Like what was really bizarre is Anastasia and I taught this.
Woods.
They closed the woods. They were like, do not go into the woods.
But like Anastasia and I taught this. We had the privilege of teaching at a couple of universities an immunology of COVID class during that. And it was cool because we got to go through all the literature as it was coming out and actually go through it with the kids. And what was started to become really unnerving to us was that the literature didn't reflect the public messaging at all. Like at all. It was very, very bizarre. And so we were awakened to this idea that the science was being implemented in statecrafting more than it was being utilized as this pure search for objective reality. And so I think that there is this inextricable intertwining of the state with science in the way that it's funded, the projects that you can even pursue as a young scientist. They're sort of like restricted to this narrow domain. And yeah, I wonder what your thoughts are about that in terms of science.
I wonder what your thoughts are, because do you think that they knew that masks were ineffective, but they did it anyway? Here's the kind of conservative conspiracy talking point. They wanted to see how far they could control the population. The libtards. And they knew that the masks were a bunch of baloney. They knew that the vaccines weren't going to stop the spread and so on, but they did this just to control it. Or did they just not know? Like, we're just acting from ignorance. I probably should have the governor should have given a speech like you just did, Anastasia, but I just didn't. I just said, close everything down, close the woods, whatever. And it's more out of ignorance rather than malice. I mean, what is your sense?
I mean, I think there's a lot. I think you got to always follow the money, first of all. I mean, honestly, I spent the first part of my scientific career working in immunology and virology, and it was outrageous to me that someone would suggest you were going to stop a fast mutating respiratory virus with a vaccine. Like, and everybody I knew who was an immunologist, if they could take off their political hat for a second, they were very aware that that was not a reasonable. So it seemed that was the first sense that I got that something wasn't quite right, because I was like, this isn't the way that an immunologist or a scientist would approach this problem. We need to address it on multiple fronts, just all these things. But instead, it was this single monolithic fixation on this pseudo solution to the problem. And that really worried me about the entire thing. And if you think about record-breaking pharmaceutical industry growth in that period, and I don't think that there's any like they men at the top pulling strings or trying to control people and stuff. I really just think that it's a confluence of perverse incentives that got out of hand. And with the increasing capture of our government structures by different corporations, I think it's quite understandable.
Like, we know that there's a revolving door between the pharmaceutical companies and the FDA. I think that for the last 30 years, except for one guy, every single chairperson of the FDA has been a former pharma executive. And I'm like, that feels significant. We know that the government spent $1 billion advertising the Pfizer, the vaccines. We also know that there was a huge PR campaign on the basis of compassion and morality, which I think was the creepiest part of the entire thing, which was that if you don't do this thing, you're a bad person. And that was, I think, the fracture that brought the entire thing out into the open. Because you have all of the sudden scientific evidence that, like Shilo was saying, we're looking at the literature and the science is like, hey, you probably shouldn't be using PCR tests to check for this because you're not running a gel after you run your 40-cycle RT-PCR. And
there was a freaking Nature Medicine paper that came out where they intentionally infected people with COVID.
Well, that was really late, but yeah.
I mean, but this narrative was still persisting.
That was was really. Did you see that Nature Medicine paper he's talking about? Oh my God, it was the intentional challenge trial. They took a bunch of young, healthy volunteers and they gave them all like horse
10,000 times the dose you'd need to get COVID.
I think a little bit less than that. I think like 100 times, but they gave them a super infectious dose. I think only 50% of those people who were in the test got sick. And of those 50%, there was absolutely no correlation between level of symptoms and PCR loads.
No, it's beyond my pay scale there on that, so I'll take your word for it. That sounds pretty damning for what happened after that. But one last, benefit of the doubt test for the for public officials. what if it's a sort of a signal detection problem? What if it turns out that COVID had a death rate of like Ebola or AIDS? 50% of the population will die on my watch. So after the fact, we know, okay, well, it was, slightly worse than a flu or something like that. Definitely worse than a flu, but nothing like Ebola or AIDS. But if you don't know that, and what if it happens on your watch and half the people in your state die? That why didn't you close the schools? Why didn't you, do this and that? It's like, well, I just wanted to let people have their freedom. Then it's on you.
Well, in the early days, that makes sense, right? I mean, I think by May or something, we knew that wasn't the case. And
Yeah,
still,
I think that's right.
Yeah,
May of
that was
2020.
kind of
Yeah.
bizarre.
Yeah.
Right? And
I
that's
agree.
the thing. It's like it was so early that we knew that this wasn't as bad as it was being said. And the science was used as a cudgel. I have never before seen people marching in the streets with signs that say, "Trust the science."
Who knew nothing about the science.
And that
Right.
chilled me to the heart. Because it's like that's the thing that I'm afraid of. I think that what I'm afraid of when it comes to, skepticism and
Centralized narratives.
Mhm.
and the
Mhm.
idea that science is the thing that goes for truth. The minute that you have somebody with a trust the science sign,
Mhm.
things have gone off the rails where I'm like, oh, we're headed for something that's really scary because
Mhm.
people don't know what it means to trust the science, a discipline that is marked by a constant evolution of final say.
Yeah. Well, here's where RFK Jr. gets it right, but the regulatory capture by big pharma or big tobacco, all that did happen. It's like, that's a system that's broken. And the revolving door you mentioned, that's not good. So don't trust the science in some dogmatic religious way. Just what do we know, and how confident are we? Just give us a number. What on a 1 to 99% scale of certainty to uncertainty to certainty, where are you on masks or vaccines today? And then they won't even know what you're talking about. But we had that language in our vocabulary of public discourse, and maybe the politician would say, well, I'm 60% confident on the mask, but I could be wrong. Yeah, that would help. It's just, I don't know. So again, when somebody, Shilo, says, oh, you're one of those scientists, they're not thinking astrophysics, somebody who studies black holes or whatever. They're thinking vaccines and masks and science, climate change, all those guys, Anthony Fauci and big pharma. Yeah, I don't trust any of that. I think that's what
that's
they're.
why it was that's why I take it so personally. Like the whole pandemic really gave, in my express opinion, it really gave big science, a bad name, and it really bums me out because I'm a person who loves to understand how nature works. Like that's why I do what I do. It's everything I do. I just want to understand the universe better and get to know this place and get to know myself and what I am and all the people around me and what the heck are we flying through this, flying through space at a gazillion miles an hour on a rock in the middle. It's just unbelievable, and I'm trying to understand it. And it just seems like the capture of those narratives, and that's why I'm really curious about your perspective on the centralization of narratives, because it seems like it has the potential for terrible corruption. And I think that it's safe to say we've seen some of that in the past, whether it's in this event or other events. And how do we protect ourselves from that in the future?
Well, I guess I'm to bring up another controversial subject of trans. People are getting confused between sex and gender. You guys are biologists. We're a sexually reproducing species. There are just two sexes. That's it. If your body either makes small gametes or large gametes, and that's it. And that's determined genetically, and so on and so forth. And declaring yourself a woman if you're born a man, it does nothing to change those biological facts. Now, gender is a different thing, and so it's more cultural and shifting and change. I don't know what. And so, but people confuse those, and then socially, well, I want to be on the right side morally of the next civil rights movement, and the LGBTQ rights, and the T part is the next one, so I want to support that. Yeah, me too. And trans rights are human rights. Yeah, that's right. You shouldn't fire somebody because they're trans, or you can't discriminate against them. Can't close your restaurant to trans people. Whatever. Same civil rights protections that are already there. Okay. But then what happens when they conflict with other rights, like women's rights? in sports, or women's rights to privacy in a locker room, and so on. We've seen this play out every day for the last couple, 2 years or so. And there you have, what does the science say? Well, here's what the science says. It's pretty clear. But, what about the policy, or what about the political aspects or social aspects and so on? And there you see it gets pretty muddy pretty fast, and then people get pretty agitated about it.
But what's crazy is that it's the exact same condition as it is for COVID science or climate science or anything, which is that there's plenty of papers that say that biologically speaking, there's no such thing as just two genders. And there's plenty of papers that say the opposite. There's a body of literature, and there's I hate to use this term, but there's a culture war over which body of literature will become preeminent. And on the basis of that interrelated body of literature, policy decisions are being made. And you see policy decisions being made one way in red states and a different way in blue states. But they're all leaning on the literature. And that's what's so crazy to me, where I start to get this feeling sometimes where there is almost no field where it's not possible to do that. Most fields are insufficiently political to drive this kind of cleavage. But in any field that's political, you get cleavages. And honestly, if you go to the deep hobbyists, you probably also will get this cleavage. You go to some amphibian mating behavior conference, and I guarantee you that you're going to find two groups of people who interpret the data one way and another group of people who interprets the data another way. That just seems like the way that it goes. And that's why it's so dangerous to use science as the basis for policy, because you end up in a position where there are two sides to the story. And depending on what questions you ask, like Shilo says, you can come up with different conclusions. And at the end of the day, the conclusions that you select are the conclusions that feel good to you on a moral and social level.
Here I'll invoke Isaac Asimov's famous paper called The Relativity of Wrong. And he said, if I can recall this correctly, when people thought the Earth was flat, they were wrong. When people thought the Earth was round, they were wrong. The Earth is a oblate spheroid. But if you think that thinking the Earth is flat is just as wrong as or the Earth is round is just as wrong as the Earth is flat, then you're wronger than both of them. I mean, one of those is actually way more accurate than the other one, even though it's technically not exactly a perfect sphere, right? So, there's degrees of being wrong. And so then at some point we have to say, well, what's the convergence of evidence leaning toward? Even if we can't be 100%. So yes, there's always these outlier studies. And again, just watch RFK Jr. on this. He's a lawyer. He's sued these companies. He's got 100 factoids in his head that he can just rattle right off.
Yeah, I want to hear a couple of your criticisms. I listened to that most of that Rogan conversation. And
well, the person to watch on this
is problems that I'm not aware of. Or?
Oh yeah, lots, tons. Paul Offit has been really good on this. Again, he does what he does. He does epidemiology and vaccines and so on. And so he's lined up. If you go to his webpage, you can see, here's what Kennedy said. Here's why he's wrong, and so on. And so for example, like the vaccines have a link to autism. Why? Because the lead the mercury in the preservative of the vaccines somehow leaks into the brain, this leaky brain hypothesis and so on, and causes autism. Well, part of the problem is we don't know the cause of autism yet, so that opens the door for anybody's theory about this. And second, that mercury was taken. First of all, it was not the bad kind. There's two kinds of mercury. It was not the bad kind that was used in the preservatives, but even so, mercury was taken out of the vaccines. This thimerosal substance that was put in these vaccines as a preservative, that was taken out in 1999. By 2000, no vaccines were given with thimerosal. There was none of this, even not bad mercury in the vaccines, and autism still happens.
But they have aluminum in the vaccines, and so if I remember correctly from the podcast, he was saying that they replaced it with aluminum, which is not significantly better.
This is what we call moving the goalposts. Okay, never mind. I said mercury. I don't mean mercury. I mean it's this other thing. And then that constantly gets changed. Okay, the aluminum that's in there is not is not at levels that could cause any kind of. Okay, it's not the amount it's the number of vaccines given at one time. No, it's the sequence of the vaccines given, that's causing the problems. In other words, no matter what people like Paul Offit say in response, the Kennedys just changed the narrative. They go, no, never mind. They moved the goalpost, as we call it.
I came across something the other day where somebody was like, measles is actually not a very dangerous disease when you're not malnourished. And I kind of scoffed at that because everything that I've ever read suggests that measles is actually a dangerous disease, and that if kids aren't vaccinated against measles, that they're going to get really, really sick and probably die. And then there was all these articles about vaccination rates against measles in West Hollywood and Orange County falling to, like sub-Saharan African levels, and all of these wealthy Hollywood parents refusing to vaccinate their kids. And I was talking to my brother the other day, and over the course of the conversation, we realized that despite all those headlines, none of the kids died of measles.
As opposed to the African kids.
As opposed to the African kids who are malnourished, and as opposed to kids from 100 years ago who were malnourished, who did definitely 100% die of measles. And diphtheria is a different one because diphtheria is absolutely terrifying. The mode of death is terrifying.
Well, this is a different question of whether the vaccines are poisoning you or not or something.
No, the question is this, is that I think that I try to approach these situations where, okay, so somebody is out there and they are saying that vaccines are dangerous, they cause autism. I'm skeptical of those claims. However, I try to look at the claim from the standpoint of, is there a there? And I do wonder if there isn't a there about the over-medication and the over-application of pharmaceuticals that are perhaps not necessary in every single case.
Both can be true, I think. I think we're talking about several different things at once, so let's kind of tease these apart.
Okay.
Certainly, the over-medication of people is real, particularly for kind of fuzzy problems like attention span in classrooms. So you got to give these ADHD boys something to calm them down, when in fact, maybe they don't belong in a classroom with rows of desks because they got too much energy and they want to run around. My little guy goes to a Montessori school, so it's not so structured. He couldn't be better there. It's great. And so it could be something like that. That can be true. Certainly malnourishment has to have an effect on to what extent a disease runs its course toward death or recovery. So there, your immune system and everything else that's at work when disease strikes is going to make a big difference. So I'm on board with you on that. Nutrition, exercise, air, sunshine, all of this is good. The COVID-19 striking obese, elderly people that are obese with preconditions. Obviously, how could this not have an effect? But that's not to say that vaccines either work or they don't work. It's not binary like that. It's multiple interacting variables at one time that's hard to control for those things, particularly in a rapidly moving target like COVID-19 spread. Anyway, so I
guess my point is, I'm like, look, there is a tendency in our society to polarize. One person says X, the other person says not X. Vaccines are bad, vaccines are good. COVID is dangerous, COVID is not dangerous. They're lying to you, trust the science, whatever. So that's what we do. And I think that it's much more productive to look at the way that people formulate their beliefs and their worries about the world and say, hey, I think that there's something genuine there that you are afraid of. I think that maybe you have pattern matched onto the wrong thing. And this is actually a more genuine thing to be afraid of. And you're not crazy. There actually is something that's going on. And we should figure it out. Yeah. Because without that, what do we have?
Well, you have to have open dialogue, free speech, open peer review, commentary, let everybody have their voice. I was never against RFK being censored at all. Let him have his say. Let him go on Rogan. He did. And then let's get Peter Hotez on there to respond. Well, he didn't want to do it. Why? I don't know. I can only guess, but Rogan offered him $100,000, and now it's up to like $2.5 million from other people. If he would go on there, they will donate $2.5 million to his charity. He still doesn't want to do it. Why? I think probably because he's afraid that Kennedy will come up with something. He does some factoid he just doesn't know about. Right? I mentioned Paul Offit has a whole list of these things on his, but not hundreds. Kennedy's been doing this for 30, 40 years as a lawyer. And when you prosecute a case against a pharmaceutical company or a oil company or whatever, he's also into. But by the way, let me note something that's kind of interesting. I observed on the Rogan show, which you said you watched. Notice that he completely trusts the science. Trust the science on climate change. Oh, the consensus is in. You got to trust the experts. They're absolutely right. Global warming is real, human cause. There's no question about it at all. We're going to sue these oil companies for ruining the planet. They're destroying our future and so on. It's like, wait a minute. I thought you just said you can't trust the consensus science. You can't trust the experts and so on. So even he's not consistent about this, right?
I have found it really soothing to accept that people can accommodate almost an infinite number of cognitive and psychological fractures within the same person with no tension whatsoever.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. Logic type compartments in their brain. Yeah. Yeah, I do think so. So, but, again, let him have it. The thing that bothers me about RFK Jr. is that, he says, I just want a response. Somebody explain to me where I'm wrong. And people do all the time. And he never responds to them. Like Peter Hote has done this. I mentioned Paul Offit, but plenty of others have spoken up and said, okay, look, RFK Jr., here's your claim. And they'll provide the exact quote, the paper he wrote or the podcast he gave or interview. And they go, here is the response to your claim. And this is why you're wrong. He doesn't respond to that. He just goes and repeats the claim again. It's like, dude, you're not playing the game. You said you want an open debate. Okay, here it is. And then he doesn't respond. Creationists do the same thing. They'll challenge Dawkins to explain this, and Dawkins explains it, and then they just ignore him. It's like, okay,
I guess the first rule of winning a political debate is never answer the question.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
I think with Hotez, though, I think he might have been embarrassed by that first show because at some point Joe was kind of pushing him about okay, you're saying we should take this vaccine. What else are you doing for your health? And Hotez was like, I eat junk food and I don't exercise. And
yeah.
I don't know. That was a bad look for sure. I wonder if he just didn't have his feelings hurt a little bit.
It could be. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, Joe's right about that. Physical fitness matters. Working out, eating well, getting outside, getting fresh air, getting some sunshine. Those things all make a difference. I think the problem is, medical doctors are not trained to prescribe that. Maybe they are now in medical school or something, but it used to be that they'd say, well, we don't tell people that because that's not in the formula.
Well, they won't do it. We had a guy, some sort of aging by, I don't know what his title was. The dude at Albert
aging
Einstein.
researcher.
Yeah, aging researcher. And we asked him that, and he was like, well, I do prescribe it to my patients. It's just that 3% of them will actually do the regimens that I tell them to do.
Yeah, well.
So people want that easy solution.
Yeah, compliance is another thing entirely, yeah. Well, it takes effort. I work out every day, a couple hours, and fortunately I found some things I like to do, so that makes it easier. But I get it. I like when I go out with my buddies early in the morning. They start this ride at 7 a.m. So I got to get up at 5:30 and get around, get my equipment, get a bite to eat, and so on. And it's like I don't like that. I'd rather sleep in until 9 and then ride after that. But that's just the way it goes. And if you have a job or whatever, you just have to do it. And it's a time discounting thing. It's like I'd like to have a nicer body tomorrow, but I'd really like to eat the ice cream today. All right, well, you got a decision to make. What's it going to be? It's like that Simpsons episode where Homer's about to slam down a couple 6-packs of whatever that beer is, Red Tick beer, I think it's called. And his wife says, you shouldn't do this. You're going to regret it tomorrow. And he goes, oh, that's future Homer's problem. I don't envy that guy.
That's so true. Yeah, can you imagine if instead of mandatory vaccines, they had mandatory exercise at 5:30 in the morning every day?
Yes, right.
That would get people up in arms.
There are companies that do that. They give incentives for people to work out and be healthier and stop smoking, lose weight, things like that. And there's tons of apps for that. And governments try to do something like that with, I guess, tax incentives to lead a healthier life. I don't know, whatever. But there's only so much you could do. Right, those choice architecture programs, where they'll put the worse foods at the end of the menu and the healthier foods toward the front of the menu, or in a cafeteria they'll put the healthier foods, the salads and the vegetables up front because you tend to scoop from front to back, and things like that. That helps, I guess. I use the example in your state, Oregon. If I get this correct, if it's still true, you guys are giving your organs if you're killed as a donation, or unless you punch the tab on your driver's license says I don't want opt into that program. In California, I have to opt in. I'm not giving my organs if I die, unless I punch the tab on my driver's license, which I did. If I'm killed on my bike, you can have my organs. And and that has a huge influence on how many people participate. In Oregon, the organ donation rates are much higher than in California. So there's lots of things like that I think public health officials can do to nudge people into being healthier. But still, we have this massive obesity problem, and that's not good.
And I think that I mean, there's many different causes for the obesity thing, but I have this sneaking suspicion that when we spend a lot of time really worrying about climate change and talking about carbon dioxide, we're missing two, maybe three really enormous things. And I want to hear what you think about these. Number one is that pretty much every single empire that has ever fallen has fallen because the climate has changed. And so that seems to be a functional inevitability to the end of empire. And so
at least the ancient empires, for sure.
I mean, I think that anybody who's walking around and who isn't worried about it, or worried about the way that empires tend to change the landscapes in their immediate vicinity in order to impoverish them and make it impossible to flourish, is probably in for a world of hurt in another 50 years or so, whether or not climate science consensus is accurate. But the other two things are about carbon dioxide and about chemical contamination, where there's so much focus given to carbon dioxide as the one metric that we need to be focused on, because as long as we can focus on this one metric and we can decarbonize and we can get to net zero, everything is going to be okay. But then occasionally these things float up from the bottom where it's like, well, actually all those carbon offsets that people are buying aren't real. The programs for decarbonization have their own corrupt incentives in them. There's open questions as to whether or not carbon dioxide is actually as bad of a gas as it's purported to be. And I feel like it pulls energy and effort away from the absolutely massive industrial contamination that is happening all around us, where people can go to the hardware store and they can buy a pesticide that will persist in the soil for 50 years and they can just dump it. In an area where people are living off of wells, in an area where all of their water is going to run to the river, there's not a series of controls that are dealing with how we use herbicides, pesticides, and all these different chemicals. And everybody's living on this water table that is just a soup of unchecked for chemistry, because it's one of those cases where if we were to look, the ecological disaster of what's actually in our water tables, I think would be unimaginable. Because we don't look. Like, if you look at water, I've been on this tick recently.
Like, we go and get our well checked and they test for like 3 chemicals or something.
I mean, they tested for 40 chemicals, but they tested for things that were conventional chemicals. They were like cadmium, mercury, lead, arsenic, magnesium, calcium. They didn't check for pesticides. They didn't check for the neighbor's birth control. They didn't check for cocaine. They didn't check for like whatever, right? They didn't check for Prozac. Funny. They didn't check for the cancer drugs. Like, it was terrifying. We had a septic guy come to our house.
Prozac can there be in your? Don't people?
Oh man,
They piss it out. They don't throw away the
yeah, well, they piss it out or they flush it. Like, who knows?
But yeah, we had this guy come to work on our septic tank, and he was like, "Yeah, I can." He's like, "Smells like you guys don't have any diseases. That's good."
He's like, "You guys don't have don't have cancer."
Yeah.
He was
like, "You don't smell like you have cancer." We're like,
"So you guys are on a well?" That's interesting, because I'm on a well where I live. I live at the top of the mountains above Santa Barbara. We're up in a little mountain community. We're all on wells up there. So I didn't even ask when I moved in there, do you test our water for ingredients? I think hopefully they do that. Okay, a couple thoughts on this. I recommend Jared Diamond's book, Collapse. It's about the history of the collapse of civilizations, ancient and all the way up to modern, Easter Island and so on, all that. And it's never one factor. I think he had 7 different factors that lead to the collapse. No one of them could do it. But if you get the wrong combination, the right combination, it could happen. There's political warring, economic collapse, financial currency collapse, conflicts with other nations, and in addition to climate change or the denuding of your forest, like the Anastasia people in the southwestern United States. It was a combination of things. Already it was, a desert, and then you have a drought, and then they're also denuding what little forest there is, and they're in constant conflict with other tribes. And so you sort of add them all up together, and then you can get a collapse like that. As for the, are we living in a soup of chemicals? Well, the dosage is everything. So you take Prozac. I mean, how many people take Prozac, and how much is left in your urine when you pee, and how much of that goes into your sewer, you're out in the bushes or whatever, and how much of that can filter its way down into your drinking water, and then somehow you drink it and it gets into your system. How many parts per billion are there left that could actually do anything? In the case of Prozac, probably not much, but if you live downstream from a major chemical company that's dumping its waste, then that's probably a huge problem. And okay, so this, I'm way out of my area here, but I think this is what people in the public health sector do for the government, is they check on those things and to see who's polluting what are the levels, and to what extent you have to kind of triage. Maybe there's 20 different chemicals that can have a negative effect. The top 3 account for 90% of the health problems people have. So let's focus on those. Yeah, it'd be nice if we could clean up the rest of them. This is a problem with the these toxic cleanup programs, where the government gives $1 billion to clean up after some chemical mess or an oil spill, or some government program that screwed things up. And like 90% of the money gets you like 80% of the way there, and you'd have to spend that much again to finish the next 10%, and that much again to clean up the last 10%, right? So it's actually cheaper to just leave the 10% left contaminated, not uncontaminated, because we just can't afford to do everything. It's like, how much dust are you willing to tolerate in your house? Just crap on the floor and stuff like that. And it would be nice to have a perfectly 100% clean floor and carpets, but I'd have to spend all day vacuuming and cleaning, and I want to get out the house and go live my life. So I'm willing to tolerate, I don't know, maybe 10% of dust bunnies under my bed and just crap on the floor or whatever. My wife probably less tolerant than I am slightly, but but we both tolerate some. And we have a dog, so there's dog hair, and and he drags in dirt from when he's rolling around outside, and whatever. You just can't clean everything. Yeah, so there's kind of a triage, cost benefit analysis there to that problem.
But what do you think about carbon as a monolithic fixation? I mean, carbon is certainly the least toxic chemical of all.
Well,
of these
but
things
but carbon for the greenhouse effect, I think, is why the focus is there.
Of course.
Let me give you my thoughts on that. I think global warming is real and human caused. After that, the error bars widen the further out you go. So is it getting warmer? How much warmer is it going to get? Well, what's the time frame? How much warmer is it going to get in the next 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years? That the further out you go, the wider the error bars get to be accurate of what the prediction is going to be. Hard to say. Then the hardest one of all is, well, what will the consequences be? I don't know. No one does. Because one of the things humans do that no other animals do is we solve problems. So, you live at the beach and the sea levels are rising. Well, people will just move. They'll just move inland. We've always done this. There's always climate change. There's volcanic eruptions or whatever. People just move, or they get insurance policies, or they solve problems. They redirect rivers. They dam up rivers. They like in the Netherlands, where they build up these false land masses that people live on. That's what we do. So I'm not terribly worried about the long-term consequences of climate change. I think we're pretty good at solving these problems, both technologically and just socially, politically. We'll just figure out a way around the problem, even if we can't reduce carbon. The greenhouse gases, let's say. To the levels that we want. Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Here I'm on board with Bjorn Lomborg's Copenhagen project, in which he does these calculations. It's mostly economists, and the Copenhagen consensus is, all right, so you got $100 billion to spend, or maybe it was $1 trillion, whatever. It was a lot of money in the next century. And here are like the 20 biggest problems humanity faces, clean water, vaccines, whatever, just food, security and so on, property rights and greenhouse gases, global warming is in the list. Okay. What's where is it on the list? It's way down at the bottom. In terms of like, well, what's the goal? Is the goal just to save lives and help people flourish, survive and flourish? Yeah, that should be our goal. Well, mosquito nets for malaria, these are super cheap and you can do a lot more with that than you can reducing somebody's carbon footprint. And in a century from now, we're going to see the lowering of the temperature by 0.01%. And at what cost, right? So I'd rather see economic incentives for companies to develop clean energy, including especially nuclear. For sure, nuclear has to be in the equation, and other technologies like these. They make this concrete that absorbs CO2 gases. You build buildings out of and roads out of that, and just 100 things like that. And in the meantime, people adapt to the changing climate and see how it goes, rather than bankrupting because the people that are mostly hurt by that are not rich people. It's really poor people that are hurt by those restrictions on living. And finally, one last on my rant here, it's not really fair for a first world country or set of countries like the Western world to tell developing countries who are still burning wood and cow dung as energy that, no, you can't have oil and gas and coal and so on to get through your industrial revolution so you can be rich, because it's causing pollution and global warming. So therefore, stop it. Well, they're not going to go from cow dung and wood to nuclear power plants. That's just not going to happen. They need energy now to get out of their poverty. So to me, I think the fastest route there is to get poor people rich so that they can care about the climate and then do something about it. Because if you don't know where your next meal's coming from or how you're going to feed your kids next week, what do you care what the climate's like a century from now, right? So I think that's the long term.
This was, I don't know if you've read Andrew McAfee's More from Less.
I haven't not read that, but I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
I think that this is basically his argument. He's like, we solve problems, and if we meet them head on, we will figure them out. And the panic over what exactly is going to happen down the road 5 or 10 years from now is absurd, because the history of the species is filled with people prophesizing doom and gloom and extinction, and yet somehow here we still are, managing to be on the other side of it relatively successful.
I'm just wishing I could be alive 10,000 years from now to see him resurrect all of the carbon machinery to try to warm up the planet again really quickly in a hurry. Like, oh no, the seas are receding. What are we going to do?
Just run it in reverse, man.
Yeah.
Here, in addition to Bjorn Lomborg, I also recommend Matt Ridley, who tracks this with data. He's Rational Optimist and his book on innovation. All this shows that, we're really good at solving these kind of problems. So, let's turn our great minds to solving these problems. And also, by the way, more people is actually good. This whole business of overpopulation is the problem. No, that's not the problem. More people is more brains to solve problems. And in any case, if you really want to get people to have fewer babies, there's a couple simple things you could do. First, make people rich, because rich people have fewer babies than poor people. Second, empower women economically. And third, birth control technology, right? Accessible, free or cheap birth control, education, and economic empowerment, especially of women. The population just plummets, and it's already happening. I can't remember where we're at now for how many countries are below replacement level. Replacement level is 2.1 children per woman. I think in at least half the Western world countries, it's below 2 now. It's like 1.8, 1. I think Japan's like 1.4. Right? They're going to be. Elon Musk has been tweeting about this recently because he's doing his share to keep the population up. Apparently.
How many children does he have? Doesn't he have like 8? Doesn't he have like
8 or 10 children or something like that? Yeah. So, but he can afford it.
A good old fashioned Quaker family.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
So what's on the plate for you in the future? What problems do you see yourself tackling? Where are the
Where's your skepticism most
where's
needed?
the skepticism
Well,
trained on?
on a couple of different things with the magazine. Again, I mentioned I'm just looking at the last several issues here: trans, abortion, race, nationalism, energy. Oh, educational reform. Education reform is a big one. Our educational system is just totally broken. It's kind of a seat-based, as one of our writers put it, seat-based program. Right? You just get butts in the seats, and the schools are paid by the government to get filter this many people through every year, and so on. It's not based on mastery of material, and that's a problem. So we think that a series of different technological solutions, through the internet, through a kind of mastery of content step by step. And there's lots of great, like the Khan Academy, and there's lots of these great sites, brilliant. BRILLIANT.com is a company that produces these little short. I was just doing one on general relativity. Again, what do I know about this? Nothing. But they're kind of walking me through these little steps, and it's just like 2 minutes, and then I have to answer a question or solve a problem. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm never going to get through this. And all of a sudden, I'm marching through this program, like, oh my God, even I can do this. Right. And there's thousands of things like that teachers could be using. But the teachers unions and all the politicized bureaucracy of education, it's a mess. So that's one. My latest book's on conspiracy theories. I don't think those are going to go away anytime soon. I am worried about 2024. Again, just ripping up the headlines from today. Trump is still the leading Republican candidate by far. No one's even close. And the more he's indicted for crimes, the bigger his base gets, the more money he raises. It's astonishing. And while I never thought that 2020 would erupt into civil war or anything like that, I don't think that could happen in 2024. But the peaceful transfer of power is kind of on the table for whether we're going to have it or not, and that concerns me. So that kind of political polarization is something I worry about, and we'll do more on in Skeptic. My next book is called Truth. Let me see, what's the subtitle? What it is, why it matters, and how to determine it. Something like that. It's much of what we've been talking about today. How do you know? How should I know what to believe? As you guys said, this person has this study, the other person has another study. Which study should I follow? And that's a problem, because everybody's got, as you said, everybody's got their studies in every area. And so you have to kind of look at the details of those in particular, like what's wrong with that argument right there. And the only way to do that is free speech, open dialogue, just put it out there. That was always my approach with the Holocaust deniers and the creationists back in the 90s when we were dealing with them. Don't censor them, don't outlaw them, don't ban them. Like in most countries, Western countries, Holocaust denial is illegal. You can go to jail for saying anything along those lines. Even in Canada, it's astonishing. No, just put it out there. Let them have their say and debunk them, and then see what happens. And so you risk people believing it, but that's the price of a free society.
It seems like that could tie into education too, right? If we approach education in terms of learning how to tear ideas apart from both sides, as opposed to just the old-fashioned pre-Wikipedia way of learning, where you just cram facts into your head. And I did want to get your thoughts on how the education system could be improved if you have time, because I spent just a moment right after grad school working as a substitute teacher.
We both did,
yeah. And it was freaking crazy. It was basically like being a police officer. I was like, oh, this will be fun, work with kids. And it's like, no, you're making sure nobody gets stabbed, basically. And it's like, the reason for that struck me is that some of those kids just don't need to be there. I wonder with, failing infrastructure.
What age was that?
I'm sorry?
What age or grade was that you were?
I was mostly doing high school, but I worked across all the ages at some point or another.
Fewer stabbings in kindergarten?
No, but I mean, it does happen, right? And it just struck me that there is a portion of the population that would be much better served doing something other than studying algebra. And we don't really have a system for that. And I'm really in love with the Depression era CCC thing that happened, and I wonder if you can imagine a better way of approaching that population, because it seems like that's a huge problem in terms of getting the kids the attention they need.
Yeah. Let's think about this from different angles. When I was in high school, so this would be 70, 71, 72, I took shop class. I had electric shop, wood shop, and metal shop. And I still have stuff in my garage of things I made in high school. It's crazy. But I hear that they don't even have shop classes anymore. Well, trade schools, there's nothing degrading about going to a trade school and learning a trade. But again, back to this kind of elitism of science, but that's not just science. It's kind of across the board. You got to go to an elite school or else you're a nobody. And really, it's just not for everybody. And I don't mean that in any elitist way. It's just that, what do you want to do with your life? And, I understand. I just was at a conference where Mike Rowe was the keynote speaker, the dirty jobs guy.
Mhm.
And he was so good. I mean, I just had no idea what kind of an entertaining, thoughtful, smart guy he was. But he's the one who said, they don't have shop class anymore. And that's a shame. And he was going on and on about how much electricians make and plumbers make. And it's like $100,000 a year, $150,000, $200,000 a year. Holy crap. I had no idea these guys are making so much money. And they're in demand because no one's going into those professions anymore. So what's wrong with that? Nothing. Maybe waiting till you're 18 as a high school senior is too late. Maybe the cut could be at 9th grade or 10th grade. And, don't make anybody do anything, but just have more options of things people could do. As for algebra, okay, here's another one of my beefs. Because I've been teaching this class called Skepticism 101, how to think like a scientist. And there I'm teaching really basic stuff, again, like, rationality and Bayesian reasoning and signal detection theory and statistical detection theory, probabilities and statistics, how to calculate odds, how much of the world is actually based on randomness and statistics and probabilities and so on. And these are so useful for students to understand how the world really works. And, what good is algebra? I did all that, pre-algebra, algebra, pre-calculus. I never got to calculus. And it's like, when would I ever use that? Almost nobody. If you go into a STEM field, okay, let's say that cut happens at 9th or 10th grade. You decide, okay, I'm going to go into one of the STEM fields. Okay, then you should take pre-algebra, geometry, pre-algebra, algebra, calculus, so on. But if not, which is going to be most people not, then how about how to think about the world statistically, how to reason rationally, or even some basic, like how economics works. What is money? How do people make money? Where does it come from? How does the stock market work? And this idea of cumulative interest, dividend reinvestment in the stock market, these kind of basic reasoning tasks that cognitive psychologists give subjects. Like, if you put $100 a month into an account that accumulates, and you do this every month for 40 years, how much money will you have? Well, people kind of do the math in their head. They go, oh, I have this amount. But actually, it's like 5 times that amount or 10 times that amount because of the cumulative interest, compound interest. And people have no idea how that works. And how do you get all the way through high school, all the way through college, and have no idea how to think about things like that? And so one answer we get is, well, people are afraid of numbers and statistics. They don't like all the statistics and math and all that. That's bullshit. Look at the sports page. It's just jammed with statistics and numbers and probabilities. And people understand what it means to hit 300 in baseball. How do they know that? Because they're interested in it. That's why it's not rocket science, as it were. Or the weather page or the business page of the newspaper has just jammed with statistics and numbers and graphs and charts and linear equations visually anyway, and so on. And people get it. That's too elitist to say the average person doesn't understand numbers like that. Yes, they do. You just have to make it something that they care about. Because when they care about it, they can do it. Most people are rational enough to be able to do that. So I would like to see more of that in education. And,
do you see a clear path to the realignment?
I don't know how to do that because I'm not an education reformer, but there are people. We have this upcoming issue on exactly how to do that. Chris Edwards is one of my writers, and he's an education reformer. He's writing a book about this. Yeah, I think there's part of the problem they're running up against is the teachers unions, the politicization of education, and the amount of money, government money, is just massive. And so, people care about keeping their jobs. If you're the geometry teacher, you don't want, that to be thrown out the window, right? So there's pressures by the unions to protect their teachers. Well, how about a students' union? I mean, where's the union to protect the students? Because that's what schools are for. Okay, now I'm ranting, but since you asked, so I think just basic. Everybody talks about critical thinking, but they don't really teach it. Like, so you hear about the UAP or the vaccine, or how should I think about that? And something like the Bayesian probabilities, just basic stuff. It's not black and white, not binary in that sense. Let's just put a probability on it. How to think about it like that. How to do.
I think the way you learn to think about it is by looking at terrible arguments. Like, that's why I'm such a huge advocate for freedom of information, freedom of speech. It's like, if we don't have those terrible arguments out there in the world, no one will ever learn how to detect them. If you're just trying to, hide people from bad information, it's like, that doesn't do them any service. What you need is a really robust thinking population that can quickly analyze the situation because they've seen a lot of garbage. It's like Twitter is kind of like this right now, from what I understand. I don't use Twitter a lot, but now that it's been opened up, there's a lot of garbage on there all of a sudden. But it's like kind of easy to spot too, right? It's like, oh, okay, this is silly. Like, I'm still glad it's there. I don't want to get rid of it because it serves a useful purpose. It's just giving you reps. It's like doing sit-ups or something.
I want to say something. I want to add something here, which is that I'm really skeptical that it is possible to completely create a rational populace. Because I think that rationality only gets you so far. You can be smart and you can be rational, but there's still some other piece of the human spirit that is going to keep coming out. And so I think that whatever successful strategies going forward will be there in order to help people piece through information, you're still going to have the human desire for magic and things to be beyond
Comprehensibility.
Parsimonious explanations, comprehensibility, beyond the most straightforward scientific possible interpretation. And I think that any system that succeeds is going to be a system that is able to fold that human desire for magic into it. Because I think that any system that tries to stamp it out is going to end up just with a bunch of automatons. And I don't know that I want to live in a world of Spocks.
Like, we had the economist, Michael Hudson. Do you know Michael Hudson, the economist, by any chance? Incredible conversation with him a couple weeks ago. But he studies these ancient civilizations and their economies and what led them to succeed or fail. And one of the things that was the hallmark of all these successful economic nations was that they had a leader that was oriented towards some divine purpose, which wasn't necessarily a superstitious garbage. It was just that their job was to bring the cosmos into harmony with the populace. And it's like, we don't really have a place for anything like that in the modern world. And
yeah, like Donald Trump is bringing the cosmos in harmony with the populace, or like Biden,
or anybody, any of these.
The idea that that's a thing is just absurd. Yeah,
That's too funny. Well, okay, Anastasia, you don't want to live in a world with Spocks. Well,
I don't know. I don't want to. I do. I think that even Spock aspired for more sometimes.
Well, remember, he's half human. He's got some emotions. Yeah, okay, let's think about this for a minute, because David Hume famously said that reason is and always will be a slave to the passions. What did he mean by that? I mean, that we should go out and party like it's 1999? No. What he meant was that reason can get you to the goals you want to achieve, but it can't tell you what those goals should be. It's like, I want to be in love with somebody and marry them. Okay, reason might tell me how I should go about my dating process or whatever, but it can't tell me who I'm supposed to pick and fall in love with. That's just a feeling you get. And, what artwork should I like or whatever? Well, these are the goals that I set, are just kind of what I feel like I want to do. And I just try a bunch of different things and see which ones I like and that I'm good at. And then you employ the tools of rationality and reason to accomplish your goals. Okay. So I think, yes, of course, that, we don't want nothing but Spocks, but because in a way you have to have the emotions, or else you can't make decisions. There's studies on this. Antonio Damasio famously wrote about this person who had brain damage to their amygdala Their whole limbic system was kind of shot. And this is the emotion part of the brain that tells you, what you want, essentially, or fear, or what engages your attention. And this poor person had a difficult time shopping. Like they would stand there in front of the toothpaste section going, I don't know which one I should get. I got to look at them and analyze them and calculate how much they cost and what the ingredients are. The rest of us just go in there and I'll take the blue one because I like that one. It's minty, and then you move on, right? So those are mostly just emotions, emotional decisions, and then in fact, most of our decisions we make are not rationally calculated at all. Now, maybe in the long run, you have a life experience of certain things that work or don't work for you. So you've kind of underlined your emotions have done the calculations for you. The analogy I make is, we know from these studies of what people find attractive in other people. And, you probably know these, the kind of hourglass figure in women and a symmetrical face, clear complexion, healthy hair, and, kind of that in the case of women, a 0.67 waist to hip ratio is what guys find attractive. In guys, women find attractive sort of that, broad shoulders, narrow waist, and so on. But no one walks around with calibers measuring waist to hip ratios, right? I just look at you and go, yeah, she's attractive. I like that. All right. So that kind of but evolution has done the calculations for us, because this is the argument from evolutionary psychology that those are just proxies or signs for a healthy person. The clear complexion, so you're disease free, and the waist to hip ratio and the broad shoulders, you're muscular, you have a good body for making babies, whatever. These are kind of the things that we evolved to be attracted to, because that's good for reproductive success. Now, no one thinks about any of this. And you don't want to think about that. It's just like, I just walk around and go, I'm attracted to that, or food, I just have a craving for this food or whatever, and in the case of the modern world, back to the obesity problem, that's called a mismatch theory, that our bodies are designed to get as many calories as possible, especially sweet, fatty foods that taste really good. And the more of it you can get, the better, because who knows what tomorrow will bring. We may not have a meal like this for a month, so we better pack it in there. Well, now you can have that meal 3 times a day, right? And so people do. There's no off button in your brain. That's called the mismatch theory. Right?
There must be an off button, because I remember back in the day, Shilo and I, we lived in New York, and we would make brunch on weekends. And this was unbelievable. We would make brunch and then we would go to the climbing gym, and brunch was like eggs cooked in bacon fat. Like a whole tray of bacon, and then I think that Shilo would fry the tortillas in butter and add sugar and cinnamon to them. And then we would go to the climbing gym and just kind of lie there almost paralyzed. And eventually we're like, we can't keep eating that because it's killing us. But someone somewhere doesn't have that switch. And so I'm like, clearly there's a switch, and clearly it gets malformed in some portion of the population, which is why I think that there's probably some kind of chemical contamination that's causing it, but that's
maybe. But there's genetic differences in how your body processes fats and sugars and so on. Some people can eat a lot more than others without putting on weight. That's just genetic variation. Like everything, everything has a genetic component. It's at least partially heritable. That's like the first law of behavior genetics. Everything has a heritability. So there's that, and then your life history, even into the womb, what your mother ate, and how that programmed your cells to turn on or off in response to fat coming into the body and the system and so on. So it's complicated, but anyway, I was just kind of mentioning the drive of emotions. Anyway, go ahead.
But to get to your point about intuition and the value of it and the way that it comes first and then reason constructs things afterwards, I think that Jonathan Haidt has a lot of really good stories about this, the kind of the just so construction of morality, where do you know his work?
Yes, of course. Yeah.
Like one of my favorite stories is that he would ask people, to explain why it was immoral to cut up an American flag and use it to wash the bathroom or something.
Or have sex with your chicken, or
Like nobody sees it. No one else is gonna eat
Or
it. Is it okay if you?
the Mark and Julie are brother and sister, and they go on vacation, decide they'll have sex just for fun, and they'll keep it private. They each use birth control, so can't get pregnant. They never do it again. It not only did not harm their relationship, made them even closer. No one knew about it. Was it wrong? Yeah, everybody goes, "Oh God, it's so disgusting." No, it's just so wrong. Why is it wrong? Well, she might get pregnant. No, they used two. Okay, but somebody will find out. No, they kept it a secret. Well, destroy the relationship. No, it made them closer. I don't know. It was just, yuck.
Yeah.
But I think that that's important. And I think that any time that we seek truth through scientific means, we also have to take a step back and really examine the moral, social, and political frameworks in which that truth is made. Because I think our intuitions are able to tell us something that reason can't possibly derive us to. Like the story of the young woman who's got this guy friend who's really nice, and he's, he checks all the boxes, but he just doesn't smell right. And so she never is that into him. That's, no matter how good he is on paper, it's still not a thing that she can reason herself into without terrible consequences 20 to 30 years down the line. And
do you know about the t-shirt smell test with co-eds, college co-eds?
Yeah. Do you know about the fact that birth control messes with that?
Yes, right. Yeah.
Right. And so it's like, okay, we know that intuition is important. The co-ed smell test is the fact that you can give people just shirts that women, you can give them shirts that men have sweated into, and they can tell if they're going to find the person attractive just on the basis of the smell, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the birth control thing is the fact that it turns out that when you take birth control, hormonal birth control, it affects the way that you process that smell. And so women that meet someone when they're on birth control and then go off of birth control later on in the relationship suddenly wake up in a relationship where they're like, oh no.
You smell terrible. Take a shower.
I can't even imagine that. But
dude, I'm sorry, but you stink.
It's just like irrevocably, irreparably. Like I can't even imagine.
Funny. Well, but so what are those intuitions telling us really? Why are they there in the first place? And probably evolution designed those things for certain reasons, mate selection, for example. Or just take the case of fear or intuitions about environments that feel fearful. Well, women are far more sensitive about potentially dangerous environments than men are, for good reason, because you have smaller bodies, you're weaker compared to men, you're at greater risk of violence by men, and so on. So women should be more intuitively risk averse than men are, and they are. Even in mate selection. Just reading David Buss's latest book, When Men Behave Badly. And, David has these massive data sets. He's at UT Austin. He does it, one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology. These massive data sets from these dating sites, instead of an N of 100 or 200 or 300, they have like 1 million people that are on these dating sites. And they give them surveys, like how many dates would you need to go on before you'd be intimate with somebody on the dating site? The average for women was 7. The average for men was less than 1. In other words, for every guy that said 2 dates, there's some guy that said, why go on a date? Let's just have sex. Right. And and then like how many partners have you had, and how many partners would you like to have in the next decade, something like that. And for the men, it was like 5 times higher than for women across the board. And so on and so on. There's a bunch of these kind of questions that get at this. To what extent are you risk averse and cautious versus, just careless and risk free about sex? And there's a huge sex difference there on those. And David's interpretation of this is, evolution. Because again, back to what is a woman? It's a person, an adult human that makes large gametes called eggs, and you don't have that many, and you can only process one every 9 months at most, and therefore you have to be really careful about what you do with this, and who your partner is, and and protect your body and the threats of violence and all this stuff. So you can't afford to be as carefree as guys are, and that's the theory behind it. And there's interesting subjects on that of late, of that critics, mostly by conservatives, but not all, that the feminist sexual liberation movement of the 60s and 70s was not good for women. Telling women you can have sex like a man sounds good politically. You should be free to do whatever you want. Yes, absolutely. People should be free to do what they want. But should you? And so this argument is that this does not bode well for women because, women having all this carefree sex, that's not what their psychology is geared toward. And, these studies kind of show that out. Anyway, it's just an interesting.
There's actually a really big movement right now of blowback against sexual liberation that you can see on TikTok, on Tumblr. It's kind of a wave of sex negativity that's coming out where I think that women are starting to realize that there are differences. But then you have all of this other stuff, which is that, hey, there's not really differences, and if you don't like the body that you're in, you can transition and you can change the body that you're in and you can live as somebody different. And there's this transhumanist thing that's coming into the fold that basically says that we have an infinite ability to change who we are. And not only do we have that ability,
I saw a guy who changed into a collie on Twitter the other day.
God, that was terrifying. That guy was
a collie? Did you say a collie? Is it a dog?
It's incredible. He changed his body. He literally
he has a fursuit. He's a
it's
furry.
a suit.
It's
Okay.
I saw that
sorry.
too. He has a fursuit.
No, but there's a school in Portland where some kid advocated.
No, that was my dad looked it up. That was garbage.
I'm sorry.
What are they called? Furries, right? Furries?
Yeah. So the guy's, he has a really, really lifelike furry suit of him as a border collie. And there's this video of this very nice looking blonde woman taking him for a walk in Central Park or something. And it's hilarious.
Sounds like a guy just trying to get attention of women, walking around with a puppy.
Except so much darker and weirder. There's all these little dogs that come up to him to try to smell him.
Sniff him.
And you can see them panic as soon as the realization hits that it's not really a dog.
That's
and
funny.
somebody was like, can you imagine having the same experience with a human where you walk up to somebody and they look like a human and then they start to move and you're like, oh my God, that's a dog in a human suit.
That's a nice thought experiment. Yes.
Yeah. But the point is that
I know
feel
a lot
like
about this, unfortunately, because it's part of our issue on trans. There's several different things going on. There is something called gender dysphoria that is real, and it's a tiny percentage, like 0.01% of the 0.017% of the population, very small, like one every 55,000 or something. From a very early age, feels that they're in the wrong body, as the description is, and that's been around for a while. Then there's something called rapid onset gender dysphoria, RODP, and that's a relatively new diagnosis, really just in the last decade or so. And this is where the gender dysphoria comes on in puberty, in which people are feeling confused about who they are and what their bodies are as their bodies are changing because of all the hormones and so on. And then they go through the usual prepubescent to pubescent change in emotions, depression, anxiety, and whatnot. And then, so this is called the social contagion hypothesis about why there's such a huge spike in trans identification in the last 5 years or so. And that is to say, the explanation here given for your confused emotions and confusion about how you feel about your changing body is that you're in the wrong body. You're actually the opposite sex. And if you take these gender affirming medications, hormones and puberty blockers and so on, then your depression, anxiety, and various emotions will go away. So again, it's too soon to tell for sure, but it's looking more and more like this does not happen. This does not attenuate the depression and anxiety. It doesn't solve the problem. A lot of these people are on the autism spectrum as well, so that adds confusion to the matter. And then now we're seeing a big spike just in the last year of detransitioners. That is, people coming out and saying that wasn't the problem at all. It turns out I'm gay. And that's what the confusion was, or whatever. And, so now a lot of gays are actually getting concerned about the trans movement. There's a cut in the LGBT between the LG and the T, LGB, the cut at the T. because the T people are saying, you're not gay, you're straight, you're just in the wrong body. And now the gays and lesbians are going, no, 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 no. Being gay and lesbian is a real thing. We're not in the wrong body. So that's where the debate is at the moment. And again, personally, I don't care what people do. Guy wants to be a collie dog, fine, I don't care. But the moment you start doing medical procedures on children, underage, minors, that's getting to be serious, because these are irreversible. This idea you can just give somebody a puberty blocker and just hit the pause button on puberty for a while, see how it goes, and then turn it back on again. It doesn't work that way. Once you hit the pause button and you start pumping those hormones in, the body's going to be different. You are not going to be the same. Not to mention, the even worse are the surgeries. These women getting a top surgery, they get their breast cut off. They get a double mastectomy as a teenager. I mean, this is a huge thing. With the women that have to get double mastectomies because of breast cancer, this is a life-changing thing for them. It's massively influential in their lives. And these teenagers are just doing it willy-nilly because their friends are doing it and so on. So this is, I'm called a transphobe for saying these kinds of things, but that's where it looks like the science is, if we want to follow the science.
But even the medical stuff aside, it seems like it's all motivated by the willingness to free people, like when they allow these processes to happen in their children or promote them even. It seems like it's motivated by this will to liberate their kids. Like we have a friend who's pregnant right now, and she's like, I'm not going to raise my kid with any gender identity whatsoever because I don't want to bias them. And it's like, that seems like you're liberating the kid in some sense, but at the same time, the motivation is because, well, it was really hard being a woman, like being a teenager. It was really hard being a woman. It's like, yeah, it is really hard being a woman. Like it is hard being a man too. It's hard to be a teenager, right? It's hard to be a human being.
Exactly.
And like the idea of protecting people from that experience just seems like you're just actually complicating the situation even worse. And I wonder about that in terms of people not having.
Absolutely. Yeah. The social contagion part also, where your peers are all going through this. So, I mean, there are examples of classrooms where like a quarter to a third of all the girls are identifying as boys and vice versa. Half the class says they're trans. Like, how can that be? The real number has always been, well less than 1%, like 0.01%. And now all of a sudden it's 25% identifying as trans. And then there's also this weird disappearance of lesbians. Where somebody wrote an essay called "Where'd the lesbians go?" They're gone. Well, and part of it is that these gays are being told, these young kids are being told, you're not gay, you're straight, you're just in the wrong body. So transition, get over it. Almost like the old in the 90s, the conversion therapy. We're gonna pray away the gay, right? Thankfully we're past all that. But now people like Andrew Sullivan has been writing about this. He's a gay conservative, and he said when he was 13, he was attracted to other boys and very confusing. And then he finally comes out, and now it's okay. And but now he's worried that young boys who are attracted to other boys are going to be told, you're actually a girl. That's why you're attracted to boys. Well, come on, let's see what. So the general consensus now seems to be watchful waiting. Don't do anything. Don't take irreversible medications and surgeries. Just wait and see what happens, and give all the support you can to your child or your students or whatever, but don't do anything. Just see how it goes. And it looks like most of them will just get through it, like we all did going through puberty. And if you're gay, that's okay, that's fine. And just, but we're still in the middle of it. I think it'll come around once lawsuits are filed against physicians and medical centers. This has already happened in England. The Tavistock Center was the big transition hospital in London, and they got shut down by the National Health Service for medical malpractice. Essentially, they knew they were going to get sued by all these kids that are now becoming adults. That they want to have kids. They want to be normal adults, and they've ruined their bodies. They can't have babies anymore. And so yeah, it's really tragic.
Has it been hard for you to come out and say this kind of stuff? Because I've kind of always assumed that the skeptic and skeptoid audience leans pretty far left.
Most of them do. I'm not far left leaning, I'm a libertarian or classical liberal. I'm more of an issues person and I'm a freedom guy, just let people do whatever they want. I've always taken the skeptical and humanist movement to be not political. I've just encouraged them, don't be political. Back in the 90s, when I was talking to some of the leading humanist people, their groups, they had kind of a set of boxes to tick that means you're a humanist. Like, what is a humanist? Well, here's the things we believe. Well, a lot of them were political issues. Like you have to have this position on immigration and that position on abortion and so on. And they're like, hang on, that's like the Democratic Party. You've just eliminated half the world, half the country that won't join your group because you told them they have to believe these things. Forget that. Just be pro-human and pro-freedom, and so on. Anyway, so that's not a problem for me because I'm not just an old school liberal in that sense. But also, I'm not cancelable. I've kind of created a environment around me that is sustainable, even if people call me a transphobe or a bigot or whatever. I don't care. I just don't care. I've developed a thick skin. I've been called a lot of things. So it just doesn't really bother me. And I don't have a boss to be fired that can fire me. I am my own boss, so I don't care about that either. And I have enough money to live okay. I'm not a rich guy, but I own my own magazine. I own Skeptic magazine, so no one can take that away from me. I would worry if I was in my 30s and I was a professor, assistant professor, and I didn't have tenure yet. I would probably keep my mouth shut.
That sounds like a familiar role that you're describing.
Yeah, I know. Sorry. What I'm saying is that when people tell me I have to keep my mouth shut and my head down, I understand. It's a very risky world to speak out about these controversial issues, and the target is always moving about what you can say that would then become cancelable, where you are fired or you're ignored by your colleagues, or you'll never get tenure or a raise at the corporation or whatever because you said the wrong thing. I'm sympathetic.
I look forward to seeing how you deal with this in your book about truth, because I feel like this has to be a part of it, because you can't deal with scientific truth without also dealing with the fact that you're going to have to come up against consensus at some point, most likely. And that's going to be a really terrifying place, because everyone around you is going to vilify you for looking at the data in a different way. And it's going to feel like you're living in an upside down world, because you're going to look at the data and you're going to be like, look, the text says this, but the figure shows something completely different. Like, I don't know if you've ever had this experience.
Yes.
In grad school, you always have journal clubs. And so for my entire life in academia, there would always be, we would read papers together as a group. And that was such a fantastic environment to come across the fact that the figures in the paper do not tell the story of the text sometimes. They're just pointing in completely different directions, and it gets past editors, it gets past readers, and you're stuck with it, you're looking at it, and it's published, and they got away with it. And if it's something that doesn't really matter, it doesn't really matter. 90% of cancer papers don't say anything meaningful anyways. Like, who cares? It's just another one that's wrong. But there's going to be things that do really matter. And I think that when we start to talk about scientific truth beyond just thinking about what does it look like, I think that it also has to have this aspect of how will you have the guts to say so when no one else does? Because all that it takes is just a couple of people being able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a couple things: you could be respectful to your colleagues and your friends, your cohort. Be a careful listener, steel man their arguments, ask a lot of questions thoughtfully. That's interesting. I'm not sure I understand where you're coming from. Can you explain this a little more? Or, what's the evidence for that? Are you sure? Or, what would it take to change your mind? Just curious, what would it take to change your mind on this? Is this a testable idea? Is it falsifiable? Don't be an asshole. Don't be, oh, you're just wrong, or you're crazy libtard or something like that. It's not going to get you anywhere. So something like that. Or you just keep your mouth shut, keep your head down. I know a lot of people like that. And I understand that. I don't blame them for, this is what I do. I'm a public intellectual, so I speak out on everything on Twitter. for example, and I just try not to read the comments for the most part, just because I know it's probably going to come at me. But I just try to be, honest. This is just give me what's the best argument for why you think that a man can become a woman. Why do you think that? Because I just don't see it. I mean, just wearing, having long hair and wearing a dress and getting breast implants, that isn't what a woman is. That doesn't make you a woman. Why do you think it does? I mean, really, do you think reducing women to just boobs and long hair, that's it? Don't you think a woman is more than that? And then, when you say that, they go, yeah, okay, that does seem kind of degrading to women to reduce them to that. Yeah, okay. But you have to say, I said it a little sarcastically there, said it a little more respectfully, maybe. And just try to listen to, okay, gender, I get that. I see where you're coming from about gender roles and those. Yeah, there's a lot of bad history about the treatment of women in the past. So yeah, gender roles I understand that. But we're talking about biology here. That's slightly different. I don't know, something like that. But you got to speak out. Really, people need to speak out because polls show that the vast majority of people do not accept the whole woke trans movement. They don't. They know a man can't become a woman and vice versa. They know this. They have two eyes. So the people that are saying this are in a tiny minority, but they have veto power, through cancel culture. But if enough of us speak out, then everyone else will speak out too. Then okay, it's okay if I say something now because I see most people agree with me. This is called the pluralistic ignorance, or the spiral of silence, where everybody thinks everybody else believes something when they don't. The classic study on this is with binge drinking in college campuses. Individually, you ask students, how do you feel about binge drinking? Oh, I don't like it at all, but everybody I know does it and they love it, so I'm going to do it. But if they all knew that no one wants to do it, then they just wouldn't do it. Right? So this is how bad ideas can hover around in a culture for a long time if there's no free speech, if no one knows what everybody else is thinking. And so this is why dictators shut down the press the moment they get into power. They don't want people to know what people think of them, because if everybody knows, then they might stand up and revolt against it. Right? So you have to silence people. And if you don't have good arguments, then you just have, the moment someone says, you say something like, I don't think a man can become a woman, you're a transphobe. Okay, that means they don't have any arguments. They know they're wrong. Otherwise, they just have to resort to name calling. And so I just call them out on that. Oh, you mean, is that your argument? That's the best argument you have? Is it calling me a transphobe? Do you have any data? Do you have any examples? And but again, I can say that because of my position. But I think the more people speak out, then the less those bad ideas can last.
Yeah, it seems like a natural pendulum swing from the bigotry of homophobia, which was pretty strong even when I was a kid. It seems like it's a natural sort of overswing of that movement. And, now, of course, we have to reconsider people who are straight being alienated and people who want to embrace and understand as children what it means to be a woman and what it means to be a really good masculine man, and what does that look like? And those visions get kind of sidelined in the modern era, and I'm sure that the pendulum will swing back eventually.
I hope so. This is what I've been telling my wife for years, and she keeps asking me with example after example, when's that pendulum going to swing back? Like, any day now, really, any day now. I don't know. These social movements, they do take years to play out. There's examples of this in the past, the Satanic Panic in the 80s, where there was this mass hysteria about satanic cults all over in America. Every city had one, until finally the FBI got involved and said, all right, we're going to flush out these satanic cults once and for all. And they couldn't find any.
Yep.
The whole thing was just a total mass hysteria. And then the recovered memory movement in the 90s. This was people as adults in therapy recovering memories of being sexually molested as children, usually by a father, grandfather, uncle, or friend of the family. And now these guys are old, and the adult women are like in their 30s recovering these memories. Well, these are examples where there were no sibling or friend corroboration of the molestation. These are completely made up stories in the therapy session. And we've deconstructed exactly how this happens. It takes like 6 months. a therapy where, you go in for depression or anxiety or eating disorders or whatever it is. And the therapist who believes that child molestation is rampant and everybody is a victim of this. And then they say, well, people that have these symptoms that you have turn out they were molested as children. Well, I was never molested as a child. Well, maybe that's true, but people repress the memories of the trauma, and that they don't remember that this happened. So let's analyze your dreams. Let's go into hypnosis. Let's talk about it. And then 6 months later, the person has a full-on total memory of being molested. And there were people that actually were tried and convicted and imprisoned for child molestation. It's about one of the worst things you could be convicted of, based on nothing more than one of these recovered memories. So finally, by the late 90s, 99, 2000 or so, a bunch of these adult women now recovered from this recovered memory nonsense and realized what a mistake they made. And they sued the therapists for malpractice. And that shut it down immediately. The moment lawyers got involved, the whole movement ended, and we haven't really heard from them since. So these things can be brought around, but it usually takes around a decade or so of a bad idea that hovers around in a culture before it's ended. So I think that will happen maybe by 2030 or so. We won't be hearing what happened to all the trans people. There was 20-30%. Now it's back to where it was, 0.01%.
The furries are in the wings waiting for their
The furries.
time to shine. That's going to be the next path. I mean, transhumanism is going to open a crazy amount of doors. I feel like I have a view of the world where everything is a shadow of what will come later. And not in a slippery slope kind of way, but just in a sense of capability and a desire and even just the mental headspace for it. And so I can imagine that this is the path forward towards transhumanism. But that
so
is
use that term. I've heard that in the recent year or two, because that used to have a different meaning. Transhumanists back in the 90s and 2000s were people that were transforming their bodies for longevity, for health. These were the people that had this vision of people living forever. The low calorie diets, and you get the joint replacements, and you get the cochlear implant, and we're going to get memory chips, and the whole Elon's mind. What's his company called?
Neuralink.
Yeah, Neuralink. Yeah, we're going to do all that stuff, and we are the first. Like Ray Kurzweil, we're going to hit the singularity. We're going to be the first generation that lives forever. And on and on. And that's what transhumanism was. It was kind of cool. There was a lot of libertarians in that group too. And to me, it always felt kind of like a religion. Like, ooh, we get to live forever. We're the special chosen ones. But I always liked it because it was pro-technology and science and all that. And who wouldn't want to live longer? Maybe I don't get to live forever, but maybe you guys can figure out Alzheimer's or something for when I hit the wall, right? And now it means this, trans. It's like, oh no.
No, I think that all of these surgical interventions that you're talking about, the Neuralink, the being able to repair your body, being able to make enhancements, have cybernetic implants that make your body stronger than it would be otherwise. These are all modifications, and we have a way of treating cosmetic surgery that's not super positive. It's kind of, if you get it, you have to make sure that you get really good surgery so that nobody sees that you've gotten the surgery, because it's kind of not, it doesn't have a lot of status associated with it. And if you can normalize massive surgical intervention into the body, then it makes all these technologies much more easily acceptable on a wide scale. And so I think that that's how I see it relating to transhumanism, which I'm using in the same way that it was used in the Kurzweil sense. But I think that massive surgical intervention on a social scale is coming into the limelight with the trans movement for the very first time. And these are massive surgeries, right? The reconstruction of body parts, the changing of anatomy. There's, I think that hormones, like there's lactation implants. Somebody like talking about doing like uterus transplants.
Yes, I've read about some of this, right?
Direction.
But it's still, because they want to actually become the other sex. How do you do that? Well, okay. But let's see. Let's think about this out loud for a minute, step by step. If you dyed your hair because your hair was getting gray, or you wanted to be blonde or brunette or redhead or whatever. I don't think that has any social stigma, right? No one cares about people who dye their hair. Breast implants for women. I don't think anybody cares about that.
I beg
do
to
they?
differ,
You
actually.
do? Yeah.
Yeah, like I think that dyeing your hair does have a lot of social status. Like
Social
I'm
status,
just
but not stigma, right?
stigma in certain places. I mean, it's weird. It's not. You would expect it not to have any stigma, but it kind of does.
I was
Really?
thinking someone in the YouTube comments told me to accept the bald and stop and take my wig off. I was like, that's freaking hilarious. Like,
Well, at the rate
don't
I'm
have a wig.
going, I'm going to have to go full Joe Rogan here in a couple more years and just shave it off.
No shame there, man.
See?
No shame.
Yeah. So, but again, I don't think anybody. To me, it doesn't seem to matter. Again, let's talk about breast implants. Does that have any stigmas? I don't think so. I mean, who cares? I mean, other than a Seinfeld episode joke, right, where Jerry wanted to know if they're real or not, and and then she ends up at the end of the episode telling him after she broke up with him they're real and they're spectacular. But that was just kind of humorous. I don't think. So how many more steps if you get a cochlear implant so you could hear? I have 2 hip replacements so I can run and still do sports. No one cares about that, right? That's okay. What would tip it over into something that seems inappropriate?
Well, it's so funny because I feel like the breast implants thing is definitely a topic of conversation at the very least. It's like somebody who walks into a room that just got breast implants. Nobody's going to say anything to their face, but everybody's going to form a judgment that is then going to be discussed on the ride home or whatever. When it comes to cochlear implants, there's definitely a movement among the deaf community that getting cochlear implants to remove deafness treats deafness as a disease and a disorder, which it shouldn't be treated as.
Oh, yeah.
I did not know that.
So I'm like, I think that there's a stigma against surgical intervention. Something like hip replacements, I think, are not viewed that way because it's somehow medicalized. Like, I think that because I don't think that there's anybody in the world that has formed an identity on the basis of not having working hips. Like, I find it hard to believe that there's the like.
Yeah, sure. That's pure medical rather than cosmetic. Yeah, I see what your point is. Is it cosmetic? Okay.
And even if you have a disability, that you then have a community that orients themselves around it. And then you start to propose that we should change that disability surgically to bring somebody into a normative frame of ability. It's just, you're getting into territory where people have very strong opinions.
Right. I was at this dinner a few weeks ago where this guy brought his new girlfriend in and she had everything. I mean, she had the big boobs and the lips and the cheek implants and the whole thing. It's like, wow. I mean, to me, just really unattractive. It's just too much. It was like a hyper stimulation. So I guess your point would be is if if you're feeling like you're lacking and you want to get up to where the norm is, whatever that is, but you go, 10 steps more than that, that feels like it's going too much.
Yeah, and you have to
like we had a lady who had just recently had like facial plastic surgery on her face who came on the show. She was anyways, it's terrible because now I start noticing it everywhere. Like every single like Hollywood movie I see, I'm like, oh no, like that person's face has been redone, and it's just like started like bothering me. And I don't think I would have, if somebody hadn't pointed it out to me, maybe I wouldn't have noticed.
But the thing that you're feeling is that it's unusual to notice surgical modifications in people, and it gives you this little feeling like the guy in the border collie suit. Where you're like, wow, that's a little weird. And so in order for transhumanism in the way that people want it to work out to be able to become fixed in the population, you have to have that immediate feeling of, worked through already by the time it becomes popular. Because you can't make money off of technology if you've got, the Neuralink shunt hanging out of your skull. That's people are gonna be weirded out by that unless wireheading has accepted
status symbol.
Yeah.
Dang, nice shank. The eye shank 3000 or whatever.
Oh man,
it's a little bit like performance enhancing drugs. It's like it feels that we want sports to be clean and that it's just your natural ability. We know people vary, so the person at the top is probably always going to be better than the average, even if the average does doping or whatever. But if everybody dopes, is it fair? Then it gets pretty messy there.
Can you imagine
ethically.
how fun it would be if everybody was doping, though, to
Kind of
watch?
are, though, is the thing.
Well,
Like, they
it
don't,
is. It's already happening.
Yeah.
In my sport cycling, like I've written about this and I've talked to Lance about it. And the mistake, I've told Lance this, the mistake you made when you're on Oprah is not explaining everybody's doing it.
Mhm.
She's like, how come you did this? He should have just said, because everybody was doing it. And if I didn't do it, not only would I not win, I probably couldn't even compete. It's like,
100%.
oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. And the NFL, come on, you're telling me these guys are clean? There's no way. No way. Right. But maybe it doesn't matter. It's almost like the Arnold level era of bodybuilding. Maybe they still do all the roids and stuff, but that's what they do. And everybody, that's accepted. Okay. So I guess it comes down to what's the acceptable social norms for that cohort of people and what they do.
Yeah, you're never complaining that your doctor was on Adderall or something. You're like, he did a good job at the surgery.
Right. I've read
Leave 'em
about
alone.
these medical students and law students that take the Adderall and whatever else they take for performance enhancement. Well, in a way, I hope it works because I want the smartest, best lawyers and doctors when I hire them.
Yeah.
Well, listen, man, it's been a real pleasure to spend the afternoon with you. I really appreciate you giving us your
Oh my
time.
God, it's after 5 o'clock. I gotta go.
There you go.
I didn't realize
Get you
we
off to
talked so
dinner.
long. That was
Yeah,
fun.
it was fun.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. Thank you so much. I hope that we're down in Southern California pretty frequently, and so hopefully we can catch you in person the next time we're down there.
Really, if you're coming through Santa Barbara, come by the Skeptics office, come up to my house up in the mountains. Yeah.
That'd be fantastic.
Yeah,
Hopefully we'll see you soon.
it'd be good to see you guys. All right.
Enjoy
All right,
the rest
have a
of your
good
day.
evening. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.